Henry sat by the window, watching the clock tick slowly. His hands trembled slightly as he stared out at the quiet street. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the neighborhood. He hadn't heard from Jake in days, and now, as if on cue, his son was calling. "Hello?" Henry's voice cracked with a mixture of confusion and expectation. "Hey, Dad." Jake's voice was cheerful, but there was something about it that didn't sit right. It was too forced, too upbeat. "I've got a surprise for you. Pack your bags. I'm coming to pick you up." A lump formed in Henry's throat. A surprise? He could feel his chest tightening. "Jake, is this about the nursing home?" There was a pause on the other end. "No, Dad. No nursing home," Jake quickly reassured him, but the way he said it made Henry's heart race. It didn't sound convincing. "Just trust me, okay?" Henry's mind raced. The last few months had been hard. His memory wasn't what it used to be, his legs didn't work as well, and his mind was constantly clouded with worries. Worries that Jake, his only son, was growing impatient with him, that he was becoming too much of a burden. And now this. He'd always promised himself that he'd never end up like his own father, alone and forgotten in some sterile, lonely place. But maybe that's exactly what was happening. He wasn't the man he once was, and Jake had been patient for too long. Henry knew his son had his own life, his own family now. Maybe this surprise was the last straw, the final step in getting rid of the problem that had become his aging father. What if you really are taking me there?" Henry's voice trembled, betraying his fear. "To the nursing home?" There was a pause again, longer this time. "No, Dad, it's not like that. You'll see. Just trust me." But Henry couldn't. He didn't want to trust. He didn't want to believe that his son, his only family, was ready to let him go. And if it wasn't the nursing home, what was it? Where was Jake taking him? He stared down at his hands, feeling the weight of the years pulling him down, the weight of his doubts, of his fears. Henry couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of the end. "Please, Jake," he whispered, feeling small and helpless. "Don't let it be the nursing home." "Trust me, Dad," Jake said again, and the line went silent. "I'll be there soon." The dial tone echoed in Henry's ear, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He slowly stood up, his legs stiff and uncooperative. The apartment felt colder now, as if the walls were closing in on him. His heart pounded in his chest, and he wondered just how much more he could take. The sound of Jake's car pulling into the driveway startled him from his thoughts. He glanced once more at the clock, then moved to grab his suitcase, his hands shaking as he packed the few things he could carry. He didn't know what Jake had planned, but he knew one thing for sure. It wasn't going to be easy. Henry walked out the door and into the car, trying to ignore the pit in his stomach. The fear, the uncertainty. It was all too much. But what could he do? He had no choice but to go. And so he did. As the car pulled away, Henry glanced out the window, the last rays of sunlight flickering in the distance. His heart felt heavy, and he couldn't shake the thought that something big was about to happen, something that would change everything. But what? What would you do if you were in Henry's shoes? Would you trust the people around you, or would you be suspicious of their motives? Let us know in the comments below. As the car hummed down the quiet road, Henry leaned back against the worn seat, staring out the window with distant eyes. The world outside seemed blurry, like a faded photograph. So much of it was slipping away. But it wasn't just the road that felt unfamiliar. It was Jake's sudden call, the surprise he had promised. Henry had lived a long life, and there wasn't much that surprised him anymore. But this felt different. His mind wandered back through the years, to a time when things were simpler, when he could walk for miles without a thought, when his life had purpose beyond doctor's appointments and worrying about whether his son still cared. Henry wasn't always the fragile old man that sat in that car. He hadn't always walked with a cane or had trouble remembering things that seemed so important just yesterday. Once, he was strong. And once, there was love, deep, unwavering love. He thought about Margaret, how she'd been the light of his life, the woman who stood by his side through thick and thin. She'd been his anchor, his heart, and together, they had raised a family, until life had its own plans. The cancer took Margaret quickly, far quicker than Henry could have ever prepared for. One minute, she was there beside him, full of life, laughing at the smallest things. The next, she was gone, and the house felt empty in a way it never had before. Their children were grown by then, moved away, started families of their own. And there was Jake. Jake had been different. Adopted when he was just a baby, Jake never knew his biological parents. His history was one filled with loss, neglect, and confusion. Henry remembered the day they brought him home from the foster system. The little boy, barely 5 years old, with wild eyes that seemed to see straight through him. Jake had been shy, unsure of his place in the world. Henry and Margaret didn't care. They wanted to give him a chance, a life where he could grow without fear, a life where he could belong. They gave him their love, their care, their attention, everything a child could ever need. But even with all the love they offered, there were times when Henry wondered if it was enough. Jake never quite seemed to trust that it would last. As he grew older, there were signs of rebellion, of anger toward the world that had given him such a rough start. But Henry never gave up on him. He couldn't. Years passed, and Margaret's absence left a gap in their lives. Henry became quieter, more reserved, while Jake grew into a man. A man with his own family, his own life, and his own struggles. They drifted in ways Henry couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the distance between father and son, or maybe it was the way life had a tendency to pull people in different directions. But one thing Henry never stopped doing was loving Jake. Even when Jake chose his wife over him, even when his visits became less frequent, Henry never once felt anger in his heart. Only sadness and loneliness. It wasn't until after the heart attack, when Henry was forced to slow down, that things began to change. His health declined, and his independence started to slip away. The house that once felt like home became a cage, the familiar walls closing in on him. Jake visited more often now, but there was a look in his eyes that Henry couldn't quite place. It wasn't pity, but it wasn't warmth either. It was something else, something Henry couldn't name, but it weighed heavily on him. It wasn't long after the heart attack that Jake had suggested, very carefully, that Henry consider moving into a nursing home. He had tried to soften the words, but the message was clear. Henry wasn't wanted in the home he had shared with Margaret. He was becoming too much of a burden, too much to take care of, too much to handle. But Jake hadn't pushed it. He'd left the decision up to Henry, as if giving him control over his own life again. Henry had never felt so helpless. The thought of leaving the home, of living in a place where the only sound was the shuffle of slippers and the beeping of machines, terrified him. He hadn't been ready to give up yet, and so he stayed. But now, with Jake's mysterious call, Henry couldn't help but wonder, was this it? Had his time finally come? And what did Jake mean by a surprise? Do you think Henry made the right choice by staying in his home? How would you feel if your loved one suggested a nursing home for you? Let us know your thoughts below. The car ride continued, the gentle hum of the engine a constant backdrop to Henry's racing thoughts. Each passing mile felt heavier than the last. He tried to push his worries aside, but the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach wouldn't go away. What was Jake up to? He hadn't seen his son this often in years, and now, he was being whisked away with no explanation, no answers. Henry glanced over at Jake, who was driving with both hands on the wheel, his eyes focused on the road. Jake seemed so calm, but there was an edge to his movements that Henry couldn't ignore. His son wasn't acting like his usual self, warm and open. There was a stiffness in his posture, a distance in his gaze that Henry hadn't seen before. "Jake," Henry began, his voice low, unsure if he should ask or just keep quiet. "Where exactly are we going?" Jake's grip on the steering wheel tightened for just a moment before he let out a soft sigh. "Dad," he said, his voice softer now, but still distant, "I told you, it's a surprise." Henry's heart skipped. It wasn't the answer he'd hoped for. It wasn't the reassurance he needed. All it did was stir up more questions. Why couldn't Jake just tell him? Was it something bad? Something Henry wasn't supposed to know? "I don't like surprises, son," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not at my age." Jake's eyes flickered to him for a split second, and for the briefest moment, Henry thought he saw a flicker of guilt. But it was gone just as quickly. "I know, Dad." I'm just trying to do what's best for you. You'll see when we get there. Henry fell silent, staring out the window again. His mind spun in circles. He'd always trusted Jake, always believed that his son had his best interests at heart. But now, with every passing minute, that trust seemed to waver. What if Jake wasn't doing this for him? What if this wasn't about making things easier for Henry, but about something else entirely? The road they were on twisted and turned, taking them further and further from the familiar places Henry had come to know. He could see the landscape changing outside the window, the buildings becoming more sparse, the houses more distant. It felt like they were leaving everything behind. "Jake," Henry said after a long pause, his voice trembling just slightly, "is this about the nursing home?" I can't go there, son. I just can't." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The muscles in his jaw clenched as if he was wrestling with something inside him. Finally, he spoke, though his words felt like they came from far away. "Dad, I promise, it's not the nursing home." Henry wasn't convinced. He had heard those words before. So many times, people promised him that things wouldn't change, that he wouldn't end up in a place he dreaded. But every promise had been broken, every single one. And now, his own son was giving him the same empty words. Henry's heart sank. He tried to steady his breath, but the air seemed thinner now, like the world around him was becoming less real. Was this really happening? Was his son about to take him to the place he had feared for so long? And why didn't Jake just say it? Why this roundabout way? What was the point of all the secrecy? Henry looked at Jake, his son's face now illuminated by the passing streetlights. The man he had raised, the child he had adopted, was a stranger in that moment. The trust Henry had in him was starting to slip, like sand running through his fingers. "I just don't get it," Henry murmured, more to himself than to Jake. "I don't understand why you can't be honest with me." Jake glanced at him, his face softening for the briefest of moments. But the moment was fleeting. "I'm doing this for you, Dad. You'll understand soon enough." The silence that followed was thick, like the tension of an argument yet to come. The miles stretched on in front of them, and Henry's mind raced faster than the car could drive. What if this was it? What if his life as he knew it was coming to an end, one way or another? What if he was being left behind, pushed aside, forgotten? The car slowed as they approached an unfamiliar building. It was large, imposing, with tall glass windows and a sleek, modern facade that looked out of place in the quiet countryside. Henry's heart thudded in his chest as the car pulled into the parking lot. Jake didn't say a word. He just parked, turned off the engine, and looked at his father. His eyes were unreadable now, like someone who had long made up their mind about something, someone who knew what was about to happen but wasn't ready to face it. "Come on, Dad," Jake said softly, his voice strained. "It's time." Henry's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the building in front of him, a lump forming in his throat. It was too much. His legs trembled as he reached for the door handle. He didn't want to do this. He didn't want to face whatever it was Jake was leading him to. But what choice did he have? What choice did any of them have? Henry opened the door slowly, the cool night air hitting him like a wave. He stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of the years pulling on him, feeling the crushing sense of loss that had been building for so long. "Jake," Henry said quietly, his voice faltering, "what's really going on?" Jake didn't answer. He just stood there, looking at his father. And for the first time in a long time, Henry saw the fear in his son's eyes. Not for himself, but for Henry. What do you think is happening to Henry and Jake? Do you believe Jake's intentions are good? Or is there something he's hiding? Share your thoughts below. Henry's feet felt heavy as he stepped out of the car. The ground was firm, but the sense of unease that had gripped him ever since Jake's phone call had only grown stronger. He stared at the building in front of them, modern, sleek, and eerily silent. It didn't look like a nursing home. There were no signs, no welcoming open doors. Just that cold, impersonal exterior. Jake had gotten out of the car too, though he hadn't moved toward the entrance right away. He stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes averted, as if he couldn't bring himself to look directly at his father. The tension between them was palpable. Henry could feel it, the thick, uncomfortable silence that hung between them, and it hurt more than anything. The years of raising Jake, of loving him, of watching him grow up and start his own life. All of that seemed to fade away in the face of whatever this was. What had happened to the boy he had raised? Where was the openness, the trust? Jake, what is this? Henry's voice cracked, his frailty evident in the way he spoke. Why are we here? Jake's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, Henry thought he might finally say what was really going on. But instead, Jake took a deep breath and glanced back at the building, his face a mixture of guilt and something else, something Henry couldn't place. Just trust me, Jake said softly, his eyes meeting Henry's for a brief moment before he turned away. Henry felt his chest tighten. That wasn't enough. It never was. Jake, Henry repeated, his voice trembling with more than just the cold night air. Tell me the truth. I need to know. His hands were shaking, and he clutched them tightly to stop the tremors. He wanted to be strong. He had to be strong. But he couldn't. He couldn't fight whatever was happening to him. Not anymore. Not with Jake standing there, so distant and cold. Jake didn't respond. Instead, he stepped toward the building, his footsteps slow, reluctant. Henry followed, his feet dragging behind him as if his body didn't want to enter, as if every step forward was pulling him deeper into something he didn't understand. The door opened with a soft whoosh as they approached. It was automatic, modern, like the rest of the building, and there, standing in the lobby, was a woman Henry didn't recognize. Young, with a bright smile that seemed a little too perfect, she wore a white uniform, and she greeted them with an energy that felt rehearsed, almost too cheerful for the somber mood Henry carried with him. "Welcome," she said, her voice too bright. "You must be Mr. Henry. We're so glad you could join us today." Henry froze, his heart skipping a beat. "I'm sorry," he said, looking from the woman to Jake, confused. "What is this place?" Jake cleared his throat, his eyes not meeting Henry's. "Dad, this is where you'll be staying." Henry's world seemed to tilt, the room spinning just slightly around him. "What?" he whispered. I thought you weren't going to put me in a nursing home." Jake's expression softened for a moment, but then he turned away quickly, as if he couldn't bear to watch his father's pain. The woman in the white uniform stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Henry's arm. "Mr. Henry, I understand this may be overwhelming," she said, her smile never faltering. "But we're here to take care of you. You'll have everything you need here. Just think of this as a place for you to rest and focus on feeling better." Henry felt a knot form in his stomach. He tried to process her words, but they didn't make sense. This wasn't a home. It wasn't a place for rest. It was a hospital, a facility, a place for people who were no longer wanted or needed by their families. "No," Henry muttered, his voice shaking. "I'm not staying here." The woman blinked, as though she hadn't expected such a reaction, but she quickly recovered, her tone now a little more firm, though still polite. "Mr. Henry, we're here to help you. Jake made arrangements for you to have the best care possible." Jake's face was unreadable, his eyes clouded with something Henry couldn't place. "I'm doing this for you, Dad," he said quietly. "You need this. We both do." Henry felt a wave of nausea hit him. This wasn't what he wanted. This wasn't what he needed. He had fought too hard to keep his independence, to remain in his own home, to be in control of his own life. And now, it felt like it was all slipping away. He looked at Jake, his son, the person he had raised, the person he had loved so deeply. "Jake, I don't understand. Why? Why would you do this to me?" The words hurt to say, and they stung even more when he saw Jake flinch. But Jake didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at Henry, his face a mask of conflict and pain, and then, slowly, he nodded. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't know how to help you anymore. I couldn't keep watching you like this." The words hit Henry like a punch to the gut. He staggered backward, his knees weakening. He couldn't breathe. "Like what?" he gasped. "What are you saying?" Jake's voice was quiet, almost broken. "I couldn't watch you suffer. You weren't the man I remembered. You've been different, and I didn't know how to fix it. I thought, maybe this would help. I thought it would be better for you. I thought it would be better for both of us." Henry's heart shattered. His son, his flesh and blood, had made the decision for him, without asking, without considering what Henry wanted. And now, the truth was too much to bear. How do you feel about Jake's decision? Was it selfish or out of love? Can you understand his perspective? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The silence in the room felt suffocating, like the air itself was too thick to breathe. Henry stood frozen, staring at Jake as though he were seeing a stranger. The words that had just come from his son's mouth, words that pierced through him like shards of glass, echoed in his mind. I thought it would be better for both of us. Better? This was better? How could putting him in this place, this cold, sterile building, possibly be better? Henry's thoughts raced, his mind struggling to catch up with the harsh reality that was unfolding before him. His whole life, his independence, his home, all of it was slipping away, and Jake was the one pushing him toward it. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. The weight of Jake's words crushed him, and for a moment, the room seemed to spin. The world felt like it was breaking apart, and Henry didn't know how to fix it. He didn't know how to make Jake understand. I don't need this, Henry whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible. I just need you to be there, Jake. I need you to be my son, not some stranger who's trying to fix me. Jake's face twisted in pain, his eyes welling up with emotion. Dad, I'm not trying to fix you, he said, his voice cracking. I'm trying to help you. I can't do this on my own. I can't be everything for you, not anymore. Henry's heart pounded in his chest. I never asked you to be everything for me. I just asked for your love, for your time. The tears that Jake had been holding back finally spilled over, his face a mixture of guilt and sorrow. I know, he whispered. I know, and I'm sorry. I should have been there more. I should have listened to you, but I didn't know how to help. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I couldn't keep watching you, falling apart. It was as though a dam had burst between them. The floodgates of emotion that had been locked inside Henry's chest for so long were now threatening to overwhelm him. His throat tightened, and he could feel the sting of tears in his eyes, though he refused to let them fall. He wasn't a child anymore. He couldn't let himself break down like this, but the hurt was unbearable. The betrayal, the loneliness, the fear, all of it crashed over him in that one unbearable moment. Jake, you don't understand. You don't understand what it's like, Henry said, his voice low and trembling. I'm not the same man I used to be. I know that, but I still have my dignity. I still have my pride. And you've taken that away from me. You've taken away the one thing I had left. Jake's face crumpled as he reached out toward his father, but Henry pulled back. Don't touch me, he said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. Just let me go. Let me be. The room felt like it was closing in on him. The cold, sterile walls felt like they were suffocating him, and he had to get out. He couldn't breathe here. He couldn't stay. I'm sorry, Jake said, his voice desperate, pleading for Henry to understand. I'm so sorry, Dad. I didn't want to hurt you. I just didn't know what else to do. But Henry wasn't listening anymore. His chest tightened with the weight of everything that had happened, everything that was about to happen, and then, in a sudden, sharp movement, he turned and walked toward the exit. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he couldn't stay here. Not with Jake. Not in this place that felt like a prison. Dad, please. Jake called after him, but Henry kept walking, faster now, determined to escape the suffocating atmosphere that surrounded him. He had to get away. He had to breathe. Henry didn't know how long he had been walking, or where exactly he was heading, but eventually, he found himself outside. The cold night air hit him like a wave, and for the first time since the argument began, he could finally breathe. The sky above was dark, the stars distant and unreachable, but they still gave him a sense of something bigger, something beyond the pain he was feeling. He stopped walking and stood there for a long moment, his hands trembling at his sides. The silence around him was deafening, but it gave him room to think about everything that had led up to this, to think about Jake, his son, his flesh and blood. It hurt, more than anything ever had. Henry had thought they were past the point of misunderstanding, that they were beyond this. But now, he realized, he had been wrong. He thought about how much he had tried to protect Jake, to raise him right, to give him the best life possible. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. Somewhere along the way, Jake had started seeing him as a burden, a problem to solve. And now, in his desperation to fix everything, he had broken Henry's heart. Henry closed his eyes and took a deep breath. What do I do now? Do you think Jake did the right thing by making this decision for his father? How would you feel if you were in Henry's position? Share your thoughts below. The cold wind bit into Henry's skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Jake and the crushing weight of the decision his son had made. The night felt endless as he walked aimlessly down the quiet street, the sound of his shoes against the pavement a constant reminder of how lost he felt. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care. The world seemed too loud, too overwhelming now. The familiar comfort of his own home, the life he had carefully built, felt like a distant memory. All he wanted was to be understood, to be seen, not as a problem to be fixed, but as a person. But in that moment, it felt like no one saw him. Not even Jake, his own son. Henry stopped walking when he reached a small park, the swings gently swaying in the breeze. The sight of them, empty and abandoned, mirrored his feelings perfectly. He sat down on a nearby bench, pulling his coat tighter around his frail body, as if the physical act could somehow shield him from the emotional storm raging inside. His thoughts wandered back to the days when Jake was young, when life seemed simpler, when the world was full of possibilities and everything felt within reach. He remembered how Jake used to run to him with open arms, how they would laugh together and share stories late into the night. What had happened to that boy? What had happened to the bond they shared? Henry closed his eyes, trying to hold on to those memories. But they slipped through his fingers like sand. The more he thought about it, the more it hurt. He had raised Jake to be strong, to be kind, to be the kind of person who wouldn't abandon the ones he loved. Yet here they were, strangers to one another in the most painful way possible. As the minutes ticked by, Henry felt the bitterness begin to fade, replaced by a slow, simmering sadness. It wasn't just Jake he was angry with. It was himself. He had allowed this rift to form. He had let the distance between them grow without realizing it. He had let his pride, his fear, stand in the way of what truly mattered. Love, connection, understanding. A noise broke through Henry's thoughts. The sound of footsteps. He turned, expecting to see someone passing by, but instead, Jake appeared in the distance. His face was drawn, his shoulders hunched, as if carrying a heavy weight. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Henry stood up, his heart pounding in his chest, but he didn't say anything. He didn't know what to say. Jake stopped a few feet away from him, his eyes red from crying. He looked at Henry, his face full of regret and uncertainty. "Dad, I didn't mean to hurt you. I never wanted to make you feel like you're a burden. I don't know what to do anymore." Henry opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had spent so long holding on to his anger, to his hurt, that now, when it mattered most, he couldn't find the words to express how he felt. Instead, he simply stood there, staring at his son. Jake took a step closer, his voice breaking. "I know I failed you, and I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try. I want to be there for you, Dad. I need you to let me." The sincerity in Jake's voice pierced through the walls Henry had built around himself. He could see the pain in his son's eyes, the guilt that was eating him alive. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Henry felt something other than anger and betrayal. He felt a glimmer of hope, a tiny spark that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. Henry didn't speak right away. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the gap between them. He stood in front of Jake, his heart beating faster now, his emotions raw and unguarded. And then, before he could think about it, he reached out and pulled Jake into a hug. Jake froze at first, but then he wrapped his arms around Henry, holding him tight as though afraid he might disappear if he let go. The embrace was awkward at first, two people who had been so far apart for so long, trying to reconnect, but slowly, it became something else, something real. "I'm sorry, Dad," Jake whispered into Henry's ear. his voice full of emotion. "I'm so sorry." Henry closed his eyes, feeling the weight of everything. Years of pain, years of love, years of unspoken words lift from his shoulders. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he knew one thing for sure. They weren't lost yet. Not completely. "I know, Jake," Henry whispered back. "I know. I'm sorry too." For the first time in what felt like forever, the pieces of their broken relationship began to shift, to align. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. But there was a foundation, a beginning. They had made it through the hardest part. Now, it was time to rebuild. What do you think it takes to mend a broken relationship? Do you think Henry and Jake can truly rebuild their bond? Or will the scars remain? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The night was quiet around them, save for the distant hum of cars and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The tension between Henry and Jake had eased, but the weight of their unspoken words still hung in the air. They stood together on the park bench, silently watching the world go by. For the first time in a long while, Henry felt a small flicker of peace, a hope that maybe, just maybe, they could start over. Jake was the first to break the silence. He cleared his throat and looked down at his feet, still holding onto the fragile thread of emotion that connected them. "Dad, I didn't realize how much you meant to me until it was almost too late," he said softly. "I've been so focused on my own life, on my own problems, that I didn't see how much you were struggling. I didn't know how much you needed me." Henry sighed deeply, his hand resting on the bench beside him. "Jake, I'm not angry with you. I was, but I'm not anymore. I just wanted you to see me, not as some old man with no purpose, but as someone who still has a lot of love to give." Jake's expression softened. "I see you, Dad. I do. And I'm sorry for not showing you that sooner." The wind picked up, and Henry pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, trying to shield himself from the growing chill. He turned to face Jake more fully, meeting his eyes. There was something different in them now, something real. Jake wasn't just apologizing. He was showing up. He was present. "I'm not the man I used to be, Jake," Henry said quietly. "And I know I've changed. But that doesn't mean I don't still have value. I've spent my whole life making sure you had everything you needed. But I've also given up a lot of myself along the way." Jake's face tightened, guilt washing over him again. "I didn't mean to make you feel worthless, Dad. I swear, I didn't. I just didn't know how to help." Henry placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his touch warm and steady. "You've been helping me more than you realize. By just being here now, by trying. That's all I ever needed." Jake nodded slowly, his eyes bright with emotion. "We can fix this, Dad. We can work through it. I'll be there for you, no matter what." Henry smiled faintly, a flicker of pride in his heart. "I know you will, son. And I'll be here for you too. Always." They stood together for a few moments longer, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. There was still so much to be said, so many wounds to heal. But in that quiet, shared moment, it felt like they had taken the first steps towards something new, a new beginning. It wouldn't be easy, but maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild. The next morning, after a night of restless sleep and endless thinking, Henry found himself sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the familiar surroundings of his home. Everything felt the same, and yet nothing was. His body ached, but his mind felt clearer than it had in days. He knew that what he and Jake had just experienced was a turning point, a moment that could change everything. But change didn't come overnight. It was something that had to be worked at, built brick by brick. And Henry knew that if he was going to have any hope of restoring the relationship with his son, he needed to meet him halfway. He couldn't hold on to his pride forever. He couldn't continue to retreat into the safety of his solitude, expecting Jake to understand his needs without ever showing him. He had to let Jake in. Fully. Completely. Henry's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He stood slowly, his joints protesting with every movement, but he didn't hesitate. He knew who it was. When he opened the door, Jake was standing there, holding a brown paper bag with a sheepish smile on his face. "Morning, Dad. Thought I'd bring us some breakfast," he said, holding the bag out to him. Henry's heart warmed at the gesture. It wasn't much, but it meant everything. "Thank you, Jake," he said, his voice quieter than usual, but filled with sincerity. "You didn't have to." Jake shrugged, his smile wide. "I wanted to." They stood there for a moment, neither of them knowing exactly what to say. But for the first time in a long time, Henry didn't feel the need to fill the silence. It was okay to just be together. As they sat down at the kitchen table, eating quietly and sharing a peace they hadn't had in years, Henry knew that this was just the beginning. They had a long road ahead of them, and it wouldn't always be easy. But as long as they both tried, really tried, there was hope, and that hope was enough. Have you ever experienced a moment of reconciliation like this? How did it change your relationship with someone? Share your thoughts below. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments, small gestures, and conversations that carried more weight than either Henry or Jake expected. The air between them was lighter, but it was still heavy with everything they had been through. There were moments of silence, where neither of them knew what to say, and other times when the words flowed more easily, as though the years of tension were slowly being erased. Jake had moved back into the house, at least for the time being, and it was clear that he was trying. He helped Henry with his daily routines, making sure he took his medicine, cooking meals, and sitting with him in the evenings. They would watch TV together, or sometimes just talk about old times. Henry appreciated these moments, though they weren't without their complications. There were days when Henry still felt the sting of the past, days when the old fears crept back into his mind, the fear of being a burden, the fear of being forgotten. But slowly, he was learning to let go of those feelings. Slowly, he was allowing himself to believe that Jake wasn't just here out of obligation, but because he truly wanted to be. One morning, as Henry sat at the kitchen table sipping his coffee, he noticed Jake standing in the doorway, looking at him with an unreadable expression. "Dad," Jake began, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I need to talk to you about something." Henry set down his cup, his heart pounding in his chest. He could tell this was important. "What is it, son?" Jake walked into the room, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About us, about what happened, about where we go from here." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I've been looking into getting some help. For both of us. I think we could really benefit from therapy. You know, talking to someone who can help us work through this." The words hit Henry like a wave. Therapy. It was something he had never considered. He had spent his entire life keeping everything inside, dealing with his problems alone. The idea of sitting in a room with a stranger, talking about his feelings, seemed foreign to him. But as he looked at Jake, standing before him with such earnestness, he realized that maybe it wasn't such a bad idea after all. "I don't know," Henry said slowly, his voice cracking slightly. "I've never been one for that kind of thing." Jake gave him a small smile. "I get it, Dad. I really do. But I think we both need it. I know we've been trying to work through things on our own, but I don't think we can do it alone anymore. Not if we really want to heal." Henry looked down at his hands, wrinkling his brow in thought. It wasn't easy to admit, but Jake was right. They had both been carrying so much, and maybe, just maybe, they needed someone to help them shoulder the weight. "I'll think about it," Henry said, his voice quieter now. "But if we do this, if we go, I want it to be for us. Not because it's something you think I need. Not because it's something you think will fix me." Jake nodded, his eyes softening with understanding. "I get that, Dad. And I'm not doing it because I think you need fixing. I'm doing it because I think we both deserve to be whole again." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, slowly, Henry nodded. "All right, we'll give it a try." Jake's smile widened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Henry allowed himself to feel a sense of relief. This wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be a quick fix, but it was a step forward, a chance for both of them to finally face the things they had been avoiding. As the days passed, the tension between them began to dissolve, bit by bit. They had good days and bad days. There were still moments of miscommunication, still old hurts that needed mending. But the foundation of their relationship had shifted. They were no longer just father and son. They were two people, flawed and broken, but willing to try to heal together. And that was enough. Have you ever tried therapy or counseling with a family member? What was that experience like? Let us know in the comments below. The days leading up to their first therapy session felt like an eternity. Every time Henry thought about it, his stomach twisted in knots. He had never been one to talk about his feelings, and the idea of opening up to a stranger was terrifying. But for Jake, for their future, he knew it was something they had to do. Jake had done the legwork, researching therapists and finding someone who specialized in family dynamics. The therapist, Dr. Lawson, was warm and patient, but Henry couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into an unknown battlefield. What if it didn't work? What if it made everything worse? Jake had been the one to suggest therapy in the first place, but now, as the day of the session approached, he seemed more confident than Henry. He had grown in ways Henry hadn't even realized. Jake was now actively looking for ways to better himself, to make things right, and Henry couldn't help but admire that. The morning of their appointment, Henry was up early, pacing the house. The familiar comfort of his routine had been upended, and now, everything felt uncertain. He hadn't expected it to be so hard. He had thought, once Jake moved back in and they started to mend their relationship, things would just fall into place. But healing wasn't like that. It was messy, unpredictable, and at times, painful. Jake knocked on the door to Henry's room just before they were supposed to leave. "You ready, Dad?" Henry hesitated, his heart racing. "I guess," he said, trying to muster a calmness he didn't feel. Jake smiled, a small, reassuring smile. "It's going to be okay, I promise." They drove in silence to the therapy office. Henry's grip on the car door tightened with every passing minute. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him. He hadn't been the perfect father. He knew that now. He hadn't been the best partner, either. The mistakes he had made over the years played on a loop in his mind, and he wondered if this therapy session would be just another reminder of all he had failed to do. When they arrived, Jake opened the door first and stepped out, his face determined. Henry followed slowly, dragging his feet. The building was quiet, welcoming, even. But the closer they got to the door of Dr. Lawson's office, the heavier Henry's heart felt. "Don't worry, Dad," Jake said, as if reading his thoughts. "This is a step forward. We can't keep running from it. We need to face it." Henry nodded, though the knot in his stomach remained. It was time to face the past, and that scared him more than anything. The waiting room was peaceful, with soft chairs and magazines scattered on a coffee table. Henry sat with his hands folded in his lap, staring at the floor. Jake, on the other hand, seemed at ease, tapping his foot lightly on the floor. "Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan?" the receptionist called, and Henry stood up, his legs stiff beneath him. Jake gave him an encouraging smile before leading the way into Dr. Lawson's office. Dr. Lawson was a calm presence, sitting behind a desk with a warm, welcoming smile. Her office was cozy, filled with books and art, giving off the vibe of someone who truly cared about her work. She gestured for them to sit, and they did, Henry sinking into the chair, trying to relax. "Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Hines," Dr. Lawson said, her voice soothing. "I'm so glad you both decided to come in today. This is a safe space, where we can talk about what's been going on. Whatever you're feeling, it's okay to share." Henry looked at Jake, who nodded slightly, his eyes filled with hope. Then, he turned back to Dr. Lawson. There was a long pause, but Jake spoke first, his voice shaky but strong. "I think we're here because we've got a lot of things that need fixing," Jake said. "I've been a terrible son, and I've hurt my dad. And he's been, well, we've both been lost for a long time. I don't know how to fix it, but I want to try." Henry swallowed hard, his throat dry. The weight of his son's words hit him, and for the first time in years, he felt the tears threatening to fall. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't sure where to even begin. Dr. Lawson smiled gently. "That's a great start, Jake. Acknowledging the pain and wanting to move forward is the first step. Mr. Sullivan, what are you feeling right now?" Henry looked down, feeling vulnerable. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I've spent so long pretending everything was fine that I don't know how to let anyone in anymore. And now with Jake, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix things." Dr. Lawson nodded, her gaze soft and understanding. "It's okay to feel scared. It's a normal part of the healing process. But the fact that you're both here, that you're both willing to try, is incredibly powerful. For the next hour, they talked. It was painful. It was awkward. But it was necessary. Dr. Lawson guided them through their emotions, helping them process their pain and frustration, but also encouraging them to see the hope in the small steps they had taken. The more they talked, the more they realized that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was worth it. As the session came to an end, Henry felt a strange sense of relief. The knot in his chest wasn't gone, but it was loosening. There was still a lot of work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, they could do it together. Have you ever felt scared or unsure about seeking help, whether it's therapy or another form of support? What helped you take that first step? Share your experience below. It was only after the therapy session that Henry truly began to understand the weight of what he had been carrying for so long. The things he had buried deep inside were no longer hidden. They had been unearthed, exposed in a way that made his skin feel raw and vulnerable. But, for the first time, he didn't feel as though those feelings had to remain buried. There was space to breathe, to heal. The next few days were slow and deliberate. There was no magic fix, no sudden transformation. The work had only just begun. After their first session, Henry and Jake made a commitment to continue, no matter how difficult it got. They agreed to go once a week, to talk openly about what had been left unsaid for years. At first, Henry had trouble finding the words. It felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into a deep chasm filled with emotions he had never wanted to confront. The guilt, the shame, the feeling of failure. It was all there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for him to face it. But with each passing session, those emotions started to lose their grip. He found himself talking more, sharing pieces of his past he had long kept to himself. There were moments when the conversations with Jake became tense, when they both veered dangerously close to old arguments and resentments. But Dr. Lawson was there, guiding them back onto the path of understanding, helping them navigate the tricky waters of trust that had been eroded over the years. One evening, as Henry and Jake sat together on the porch, sipping coffee in the cool night air, Henry noticed something different. Jake was more at ease, more willing to share his thoughts, his hopes, and his fears. It was a side of him Henry hadn't seen in years, vulnerable, open, and ready to rebuild. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day, Dad," Jake said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "about how you felt like you weren't needed anymore. I just want you to know that. I've needed you more than I've ever let on." Henry glanced over at him, his heart swelling with emotions he hadn't expected. "I know, son. I know I haven't always been there for you the way I should have been, but I've always been proud of you. Always." Jake looked down at his coffee cup, his fingers tracing the rim. "I've made a lot of mistakes, Dad. I hurt you, and I hurt myself. I don't know how I let things get so far, but I'm trying now. I really am." Henry's heart tightened as he heard the rawness in Jake's voice. He had never been one to express his emotions, never one to show how deeply things had affected him. But the change in Jake was undeniable. It was like a door had opened between them, a new kind of trust that Henry wasn't sure was even possible. "I'm proud of you too, Jake," Henry said quietly. "You've come a long way. I don't think you give yourself enough credit for how much you've changed." Jake smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Maybe, but I don't think I can ever make up for the things I did. I can't undo all the mistakes." "No," Henry said firmly, "but you can keep moving forward. We both can. We can't change the past, but we can shape our future. Together." There was a long pause between them as they both processed the weight of what was said. The night was peaceful, with only the sound of crickets filling the air, but the silence between them felt different. It was no longer tense. It was comfortable, filled with the kind of understanding that only comes after months of hard work, honesty, and growth. The therapy sessions continued, with each one uncovering new layers of their past and present. Some days were harder than others, but there were moments of clarity, moments where they could see how far they had come. Henry was learning to let go of the guilt that had plagued him for so long. He was learning to trust Jake again, to believe in the possibility of a future where they could truly heal together. As they wrapped up their fourth session, Dr. Lawson looked at them both with a proud smile. "I can see the progress you two are making. It's not going to be easy, and there will be setbacks along the way. But I want you to remember this. You've taken the hardest step. You've opened yourselves to the possibility of change. That's something to be proud of. Henry felt a surge of emotion at her words. It had been a long and difficult road, but they had come so far. He glanced over at Jake, whose expression was thoughtful, almost reflective. For the first time in a long time, Henry didn't feel the need to hold back. He didn't have to hide his feelings anymore. "Thanks, Dr. Lawson," Jake said quietly, his voice full of sincerity. "We're getting there." As they left the office, Henry couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't resolved. But they were learning to rebuild, one step at a time. And that was enough. Have you ever had to rebuild trust in a relationship? What steps did you take to move forward? Share your experience with us in the comments. As the weeks went by, the weight of their past started to feel lighter. Henry and Jake continued their therapy sessions, each one unearthing more painful truths, but also providing them with tools to understand one another better. Slowly, a new rhythm began to form between them, one that allowed for laughter, forgiveness, and even moments of joy. It was a Sunday morning when Jake surprised Henry with an invitation. "How about we take the day off?" Jake asked, a playful grin on his face. "We've been doing the hard work for weeks now. Maybe we could do something different, something fun?" Henry raised an eyebrow, not used to spontaneous requests from Jake. "Something fun? Like what?" Jake leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "How about we go to that old car show downtown? You used to love going to those with me when I was a kid." The mention of the car show brought a flood of memories back to Henry. Years of taking Jake to those events, pointing out classic cars, talking about their favorite models, and enjoying the rare moments when they could bond over something simple and unhurried. "I haven't been to one in ages," Henry said, his voice soft with nostalgia. "You're right, it's been a while. I'd love to go." Jake's smile widened, and Henry felt his heart warm. This small gesture, this simple invitation, felt like a gift. It was a chance to do something together without the weight of the past hanging over them. No therapy, no tough conversations, just two people enjoying a shared experience. They spent the morning getting ready. Jake drove them to the car show, and as they arrived, Henry felt a rush of excitement he hadn't experienced in a long time. The cars were gleaming under the bright sunlight, and the air was filled with the sounds of engines revving and people talking animatedly about their favorite models. It felt like stepping into a world of possibility, a world where the pain of the past could be momentarily forgotten. As they walked through the rows of cars, Henry found himself animatedly pointing out different models, talking about the ones he loved. Jake listened intently, laughing when his dad got particularly excited about a rare muscle car from the 60s. "This one's got a 396 cubic inch V8, Henry said, his voice filled with the kind of enthusiasm Jake hadn't seen in years. "This car right here, it's a classic. You remember the Camaro we had back in the day?" Jake nodded, remembering the way his dad used to take care of the car, washing it on Sundays and driving it with a pride that was unmatched. It was one of the few things Henry had truly enjoyed during their early years together. "I remember," Jake said with a grin. "You were always so protective of that car. You wouldn't let anyone near it without giving them the full rundown on how special it was." Henry chuckled. "I guess I still do that, huh?" Jake laughed too, shaking his head. "Yeah, but it's cool. It's like you're showing me a piece of your history, Dad. I like seeing you this way." As they moved through the show, the laughter came easier. For the first time in a long time, they weren't father and son mired in conflict. They weren't two people trying to heal from deep wounds. They were simply two people sharing an experience, rediscovering something they both loved. And in that moment, Henry felt something shift, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, but one that was significant. By the time they left the car show, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the city. Henry didn't want the day to end. It felt like they had just started to scratch the surface of a new chapter in their relationship, a chapter that wasn't defined by past mistakes, but by the small, quiet moments they were starting to create together. They drove home in comfortable silence, the car windows down, the cool evening breeze flowing through the air. When they arrived back at the house, Jake turned to his dad with a genuine smile. "Thanks for today, Dad," Jake said. "I know it's been a rough few months, but moments like this is what I've been hoping for." Henry smiled back, his heart full. "I've been hoping for the same thing." It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a life-altering revelation, but it was something real, something that made the road ahead feel a little brighter, a little more hopeful. As they settled back into the routine of their lives, Henry noticed that the healing process had begun to feel less like a struggle and more like an ongoing journey. There were still tough days, still moments when old wounds resurfaced, but now there was something different. They were facing it together. And that, more than anything, gave Henry hope. What's something simple that you've shared with someone important to you that brought you closer together? Share your story below. The weeks that followed were not without their challenges. Though the progress made was undeniable, Henry and Jake had to learn how to be patient with one another. The road to healing was paved with moments of tension, miscommunication, and sometimes frustration. It was one thing to build a connection again, but it was another to maintain it, especially when old habits and fears threatened to derail the fragile progress they had made. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the tension between them finally erupted. Henry had been working in the garden, his hands deep in the soil, trying to focus on something that felt productive. The world of cars and therapy had given him a renewed sense of purpose, but there were still days when the quiet isolation of his home felt overwhelming. Jake, who had spent the morning with his laptop, came outside, his expression a little more serious than usual. "Dad, can we talk?" Henry glanced up, wiping the dirt from his hands. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Jake hesitated for a moment, as though he wasn't sure how to start. "I've been thinking about something, about our situation, and where we go from here." Henry's heart sank a little. He could hear the hesitation in Jake's voice and braced himself for whatever was coming. He had expected some bumps along the way, but each one still felt like a sharp jolt to the system. "What do you mean?" Henry asked cautiously. Jake shifted on his feet, his eyes darting away. "I mean, you've been so focused on us reconnecting. And that's great, really. But what about me? What about my life? I've been putting so much energy into this that I've started to lose sight of my own stuff." Henry blinked, trying to process Jake's words. "Your life? Jake, I thought we were doing this together. I thought we were figuring this out, step by step. What do you mean by your own stuff?" Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair in frustration. I've been so caught up in helping you feel better, in making sure everything's okay between us, that I forgot about my own goals, my own future. I'm not sure what I'm doing anymore. I'm just sort of floating along." Henry felt the sting of Jake's words hit him hard. He had always been so focused on fixing their relationship, on making sure Jake was okay, that he had missed the signs that Jake was struggling in other areas of his life. "I didn't realize," Henry began, but Jake cut him off, his voice sharper now. "That's the problem. You didn't realize. I've been doing all this work, all this therapy, trying to fix everything between us, and I don't even know what I'm doing with my own life anymore. I'm stuck, Dad. I need to figure things out on my own." Henry took a deep breath, feeling his chest tighten with a mixture of guilt and confusion. He had always thought their relationship was the thing that needed the most attention, but now it was clear that Jake was battling demons Henry hadn't seen. "Jake, I didn't mean to take away your space to figure things out. I've been so focused on us fixing this relationship that I didn't realize you still have your own stuff to work through," Henry said quietly. Jake paused, his expression softening, though the tension was still palpable. "I don't know. I just feel like I've been running around in circles. I keep thinking I'm doing the right thing, but I don't even know where I'm going." Henry stepped closer, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. "I understand. I get it. We've both been through a lot, and maybe I've put too much pressure on us to fix everything in such a short time. We can slow down. You don't have to have everything figured out right now. We're both working on this together, but you need to work on your own path, too. You deserve that space." Jake looked down, his eyes conflicted, but his shoulders relaxed slightly. "Thanks, Dad. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to snap at you like that. I'm lost and I didn't know how to say it." "I understand, son. I've been lost too," Henry replied. "I don't have all the answers, but I do know that we'll figure it out." one step at a time. The silence between them was different this time. Not tense, but reflective. It was a moment of realization for both of them. The healing wasn't going to be linear. It wasn't a smooth road. There would be bumps, detours, and setbacks. But there would also be breakthroughs. Small moments of clarity, like this one, where they could recognize their needs and their limits, and step back from the pressure of having to fix everything all at once. Jake nodded slowly, a hint of relief in his eyes. Thanks for understanding. Henry gave a small smile. I'm always here for you, even when we don't have all the answers. As they stood together, the weight of the conversation lingering in the air, both of them knew that the road ahead wasn't easy. But they had one thing that mattered more than anything else: a renewed sense of honesty. They were learning to navigate the complicated terrain of their relationship with both understanding and patience. That evening, Henry reflected on the conversation long after Jake had gone inside. He thought about how easily they could have let that argument drive a wedge between them. But instead, they had taken the time to listen, to understand the other's perspective. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was progress. Henry realized that healing wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about facing it head-on and working through it, even when it felt uncomfortable or difficult. And they were both learning how to do that. Have you ever had a moment of frustration in a relationship where you didn't feel heard? How did you work through it? Share your experience with us below. The days that followed the conversation in the garden felt quieter, more thoughtful. While Jake had confessed his frustration and Henry had tried to give him space to figure out his path, there was an unspoken understanding that this was a turning point for both of them. They were no longer just going through the motions of reconnecting. They were beginning to build something new, something that wasn't just about fixing the past but about creating a future that was better for both of them. It was the beginning of spring when Henry woke up early one morning, feeling a surge of energy he hadn't felt in years. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft, golden light over the house. He had spent so much time focusing on Jake's needs that he had forgotten about his own. He needed something for himself, something that would help him regain his sense of independence, his identity outside of being a father. It was time to take a step toward that, even if it was a small one. After making his morning coffee, Henry sat down at the kitchen table with a notebook, an old habit that had been buried under the weight of everything that had happened in the past few years. He used to write down his thoughts, his plans, his dreams. Writing had always been a way for him to make sense of the world. He opened the notebook, grabbed a pen, and started jotting down ideas. What did he want for himself? What goals did he have, not as Jake's father, but as Henry? One idea stood out to him more than the others. He wanted to get back to working with cars. Not just admiring them at car shows, but getting his hands dirty again, fixing up old models, restoring them to their former glory. He hadn't worked on a car in years. It was something he had done before, something he loved, and the idea of returning to it felt like a breath of fresh air. When Jake came downstairs a little later, Henry was still sitting at the table, looking over his notes. He noticed the change in his dad right away. The way Henry seemed more engaged, more focused, as if something inside him had shifted. "Morning, Dad," Jake said, a little groggy from just waking up. "Morning," Henry replied, glancing up from the notebook. "I've been thinking about something." Jake sat down across from him, looking intrigued. "What's that?" Henry hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I want to start working on cars again, restoring them. I think it'll give me something to focus on, something that's just mine. I used to love it, and I think it might be a good way for me to reconnect with myself." Jake's eyebrows lifted in surprise, but then he nodded slowly. "I think that's a great idea, Dad. It's something that's always made you happy." Henry smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. It was the first time in a long time that he had felt like he was taking care of himself, doing something that was purely for his own enjoyment. It wasn't about Jake or the house or the past. It was about him, about reclaiming something that had been lost. Later that day, Henry began researching local workshops, checking out online forums, and looking for parts. He didn't want to just dive into any project. He wanted it to be something meaningful, something that would challenge him and bring him joy. As he gathered ideas, Jake joined him in the search, offering his help when it came to finding local suppliers and tools. "We'll need to get a place with a good garage space," Henry said, as they browsed through listings. I want a place where I can really dive into the work. Jake looked at him thoughtfully. Do you want to find a project car first, or should we look for a place first? I think the place comes first, Henry replied. Once I've got a space, I'll be ready to find something I can really pour myself into. The next few weeks were filled with activity. Henry found a small workshop not far from their home, one that was just the right size for a restoration project. It was tucked away in a quiet corner of town, away from the hustle and bustle, with plenty of room for him to work. Jake helped him set up the space, even helping with some of the heavy lifting. They also began searching for the perfect car to restore. Henry knew he didn't want just any car. He wanted something that would be a challenge, something that would require patience and skill to bring back to life. They eventually found a 1967 Chevy Camaro that had seen better days. The car was rusted and worn, but it had potential. Henry could already picture what it would look like when it was finished, gleaming under the sun, a testament to his hard work and dedication. He could feel the spark of excitement in his chest again, the kind of excitement he hadn't felt in years. The restoration process was slow, but Henry relished every moment of it. He spent hours working on the car, carefully sanding the body, replacing the engine parts, and restoring the interior. It wasn't easy, and there were times when he felt frustrated, but each small victory, the moment the engine turned over for the first time, or when he saw the first coat of paint applied, felt like a personal triumph. One evening, after several weeks of hard work, Jake stopped by the workshop to check on his dad's progress. When he saw the car, he couldn't hide his amazement. Wow, Dad, it looks incredible, Jake said, his voice filled with awe. Henry wiped his hands on a rag, a proud smile crossing his face. It's not done yet, but it's getting there. I still have a lot of work to do, but I'm getting close. Jake looked at the car and then at his dad, a new respect in his eyes. I can't believe how much you've done. You're really doing it. Henry nodded, his chest swelling with pride. It's been a journey, not just with the car, but with myself. I've spent so many years focusing on things that didn't make me happy, things that drained me. But this is for me. It feels good to be doing something I love again. Jake clapped him on the back. I'm proud of you, Dad. This is amazing. For the first time in a long time, Henry felt like he was on the right path. He was rediscovering his passion, his joy, and his identity. And in doing so, he was also strengthening the bond between him and Jake. They were no longer just working through their past. They were building a new future, one where both of them could be their authentic selves. What's something you've done for yourself that has helped you rediscover your passions? Share your experiences below. The restoration project was moving along steadily. Every weekend, Henry and Jake spent hours at the workshop, working together in a rhythm that felt both natural and empowering. There was something about being surrounded by tools, car parts, and the scent of grease and metal that made Henry feel alive again. Each day, it was as if he was rediscovering a part of himself he had lost. The Camaro, once a rusted shell of a car, was beginning to look like something out of a dream. The engine was purring smoothly, the paint gleaming in the sunlight, and the interior was slowly taking shape. Jake, too, was becoming more invested in the process, learning the ins and outs of car restoration from his dad. It was a rare moment of father-son bonding, one that transcended their past conflicts and gave them something to work toward together. One Friday afternoon, Henry decided it was time. The car was almost ready for its first test drive. He stood back, wiping his hands on a rag as he looked over the Camaro, his heart swelling with pride. Jake walked over, a grin spreading across his face when he saw the car ready to go. Dad, is it really time? Is it that close to being finished? Jake asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. It's as ready as it's going to be, Henry said with a chuckle. I've checked and rechecked everything. It's not perfect, but it's close enough to take for a spin. Jake raised an eyebrow. You sure you're ready for a test drive? I mean, it's been a while since we've driven anything like this. Henry laughed. You're right. It's been too long, but I'm ready. Let's see what we've got. The keys were in Henry's hand, and with a deep breath, he slid into the driver's seat. Jake climbed in beside him, his hands resting nervously on his lap. Henry could sense the tension in the air, but also a sense of excitement. This was more than just a test drive. It was a milestone, a moment that represented everything they had worked for. Henry turned the key, and the engine roared to life, its growl filling the small workshop and sending a wave of pride through him. It had been so long since he'd felt that rush, that connection to a machine that was now alive with possibility. The vibrations of the car under his hands were familiar and comforting. "Here we go," Henry said, his voice tinged with excitement. He shifted the car into gear, and they slowly pulled out of the workshop, driving down the quiet street. At first, the car was a little shaky, and Henry held his breath as he made the first turn. The steering felt stiff, the suspension a little rough. But with each passing mile, it smoothed out. The car seemed to settle into its rhythm, responding to Henry's gentle touch on the wheel. Jake watched, wide-eyed. "It's working. It's actually working," he said in disbelief. Henry couldn't help but smile. "I told you it would. It just needed time." They drove through the neighborhood, the cool wind blowing through the open windows. The car felt like it was gliding, its engine purring as they picked up speed. For a moment, Henry felt like he was back in his prime, driving a car that he had poured his heart and soul into. It wasn't just a car. It was a symbol of his perseverance, his growth, and his ability to rebuild not just the Camaro, but his life. As they reached the outskirts of town, Henry slowed the car and pulled into a quiet, open area where they could test its performance. He revved the engine once, just to feel its power. The sound filled the air, and for a moment, everything felt right. Jake turned to his dad, his eyes filled with admiration. "This is amazing. You really did it." Henry nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "We did it. I couldn't have done it without your help." The two of them spent the next hour driving the Camaro, testing its speed and handling. It wasn't perfect, but it was close. Every mile they drove felt like a victory, and every moment of hesitation, every worry that it wouldn't work, melted away. As they made their way back to the workshop, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the scene. Henry parked the car back in its spot, shutting off the engine with a sense of finality. The project was far from over, but the test drive had been a success. And for Henry, that meant more than anything. Jake looked over at his dad, a grin on his face. "That was incredible. I don't know how you managed to do all of that." Henry leaned back in the seat, a content smile on his face. "It wasn't easy, but I knew I had it in me. Just like I knew we'd make it through everything that's happened between us." Jake nodded, his expression serious now. "I'm glad we did this together. It's been good, Dad. I think we've both learned a lot." Henry placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "We've both changed, haven't we? And we're still changing. But I think this car, it's just the start of something new for both of us." Jake smiled, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "Yeah, I think it is." They sat there for a few moments, the sound of the engine echoing in their ears, the evening sky stretching out before them. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about the journey they had taken together. It was about rediscovering trust, building something from the ground up, and knowing that no matter where they went from here, they would face it together. Have you ever worked on something with someone and seen the results come to life? How did it feel to see your hard work pay off? Share your experience below. The Camaro, now gleaming and almost fully restored, had become a symbol of Henry and Jake's journey. They spent hours in the workshop every week, tweaking the car, adjusting the engine, fine-tuning the details. It was no longer just a project. It had become a reflection of their relationship, of the healing that had taken place between them. Despite the satisfaction they both felt from their work, there was something unspoken between them, a tension that lingered in the air. It wasn't about the car. It was about the future. Henry knew that he couldn't stay in this small workshop forever, and Jake had to decide where his life was going, too. There were still unresolved feelings between them. Years of absence, years of regret. But each day that passed, they got a little closer to understanding each other. One evening, as they sat together on the tailgate of the Camaro, watching the sunset in the distance, Jake finally spoke up. "Dad," he said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've been thinking about something." Henry turned to face him, the warmth of the setting sun casting long shadows across his face. What's on your mind? I'm. I'm trying to figure out what I want. What my future looks like. I mean, I've been so focused on trying to fix things with you. I haven't really thought about where I'm going or what I want for myself. Henry nodded slowly, understanding the weight of Jake's words. I get that. You've been carrying a lot of responsibility. But Jake, you need to do what makes you happy, not just what you think other people expect of you. I know, but it's hard, Jake said, his voice quieter now. I feel like I don't have it all figured out, like I'm just drifting, you know? Henry studied his son's face, seeing the uncertainty in his eyes. He'd felt that same uncertainty many times in his life. Jake, you don't need to have everything figured out. None of us do. Life's about finding your way, one step at a time. It's okay to not have all the answers. Jake let out a deep breath. I just don't want to disappoint you. I've always felt like I wasn't living up to what you wanted me to be. Henry's heart tightened, and he turned to fully face Jake. I never wanted you to be anything other than yourself. You don't have to prove anything to me. I've realized that over the past few months, more than anything else, all I want is for you to be happy, to find your passion, just like I've found mine again with this car. There was a pause, and then Jake met his father's gaze. For the first time in a long while, there was no wall between them. No hesitation, just understanding. Thanks, Dad, Jake said, his voice filled with emotion. I don't think I ever really understood that until now. Henry smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. You're figuring it out, Jake, and that's all anyone can do. The two sat there, their shoulders touching, as the sun dipped below the horizon. There were no more words needed. They were finally in sync. The past no longer had the power to define them. They were free to create a future together, one that was not defined by old expectations or mistakes. A few days later, Jake came to Henry with a surprising decision. Dad, Jake said, his voice filled with excitement, I've been thinking about what you said. I've decided to go back to school. I'm going to finish my degree, take some time to figure things out, and see where I want to go from there. Henry's eyes lit up with pride. Jake, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you for making that decision. Jake smiled, a mix of relief and excitement in his eyes. I think it's time I stop drifting. I want to do something I love. I want to find my own path, just like you found yours with the car. Henry placed a hand on his son's shoulder. I'll support you no matter what. You've got this, Jake. I know you do. The next few months passed quickly. Jake enrolled in classes, his mind finally focused on a future that was entirely his own. Henry continued working on the Camaro, completing the restoration with a sense of satisfaction and pride. But beyond the car, beyond the work, there was something deeper happening. Henry and Jake were finally building a new relationship, one where they didn't have to say everything to understand each other. The silences between them weren't uncomfortable anymore. They were filled with mutual respect and the understanding that they both had their own paths to walk. It was a rainy afternoon when the Camaro was finally ready for its official reveal. Jake had invited a few friends and family to see the finished car, and Henry couldn't have been prouder. The car was more than just a project. It was the culmination of years of work, frustration, and, most importantly, healing. As everyone admired the Camaro, Jake stood beside his dad, looking at the car with new eyes. I think this car is more than just a restoration, don't you? Jake said, his voice filled with meaning. Henry nodded, his hand resting on the hood of the Camaro. It is. It's a symbol of everything we've been through and everything we've learned. It's about growth, about rebuilding, and about knowing that we're both capable of so much more than we thought. Jake smiled, his eyes shining with gratitude. Yeah, I think it is. Have you ever had a moment where you finally understood something important that changed your perspective on life? What was that moment for you? Share your thoughts below. The Camaro, now fully restored and gleaming under the garage lights, had become more than just a car. It was a testament to Henry and Jake's journey, one filled with sweat, tears, and most importantly, second chances. The air around the workshop felt different now, lighter, as if the weight of the past had been lifted, piece by piece, with every turn of the wrench, every layer of paint, and every deep conversation between father and son. But the journey wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As Jake settled into his studies, Finding new purpose in his education and the future he was building, Henry spent more time thinking about his own future. The Camaro project had rekindled something inside him, a sense of purpose that had been dormant for years. Restoring the car had given him back a piece of himself that he thought was long gone, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he was meant to do. One Saturday afternoon, Henry took a walk through the town. The weather had started to warm, and the small, familiar streets seemed to hum with the quiet pulse of daily life. Henry passed by the old diner where he and his late wife used to have breakfast on Sundays. He smiled, remembering the good times. But something inside him stirred. It was time to let go of the past in more ways than one. He had always loved working with his hands, whether it was cars, tools, or the way he used to fix things around the house. But he realized something. He didn't have to keep it all to himself. There were people in the town who could use his expertise, his experience, and the passion that had reignited with the Camaro. The idea hit him like a bolt of lightning. He was going to open a small repair shop, not just for cars. He could teach people how to restore things, how to fix what was broken, how to breathe life back into something that seemed beyond saving. It would be a place where people could reconnect with their own lost dreams, a place where old things found new purpose. That evening, after dinner, Henry sat Jake down at the kitchen table. "I've been thinking," Henry started, the weight of his words lingering in the air. Jake looked up from his phone, a little surprised by his dad's serious tone. "What's up, Dad?" "I want to start something new. Something different," Henry said, his voice steady. "I've been thinking about opening a small shop, a repair shop. I want to teach people how to restore things, fix things, you know? There's so much more I can do with all this knowledge and experience I've gathered over the years." Jake raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A repair shop? Like, for cars?" "For anything," Henry said with a shrug. "I've spent my whole life fixing stuff, learning about tools and machines. I've seen what happens when people stop fixing things, stop caring about what's broken. Maybe it's time for me to teach others how to do what I've done with the Camaro, bring something back to life." Jake smiled, his eyes full of pride. "I think that's a great idea, Dad. It sounds like it's exactly what you need. And it's kind of like you've found your second chance, huh?" Henry chuckled. "Maybe so. Maybe it's a chance to show people that it's never too late to fix what's broken. And that includes us, too." Jake stood up and walked over to his dad, giving him a hug. "I'm proud of you, Dad. You're always thinking bigger than I ever thought you would. You deserve this." Henry held onto his son for a moment, the sense of gratitude and love washing over him. "Thanks, Jake. And you know, this idea, this shop, wouldn't have even been possible without you." The words were simple, but they carried a lot of weight. Henry knew he would have never come this far without the support of his son, without their journey together. But there was something else. Jake's courage had inspired him. The idea of starting over, of taking risks, was something Jake had shown him. Now, Henry was ready to do the same. The next few weeks were filled with action. Henry found a small space on the edge of town, a building that had been vacant for years. It had an old-world charm, and he could already see it in his mind, filled with workbenches, tools, and a steady stream of people coming in, learning, and fixing. Jake helped his dad get the shop up and running. They spent weekends painting the walls, organizing the tools, and putting together a business plan. There was a feeling of excitement in the air, as if they were both embarking on a new adventure together. They weren't just restoring cars anymore. They were restoring lives. By the time the shop was ready for its grand opening, Henry felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. The past was behind him, the future was bright, and his son was thriving. It was as if everything had come full circle, like the Camaro that had once been just a broken-down shell, now shining bright and ready to take on the world. On the day of the opening, Henry stood behind the counter of his shop, his heart swelling with pride. The sign outside read, "Henry's Restoration Workshop." It wasn't just about fixing things. It was about giving people a chance to reconnect with what mattered, to find their own purpose. Jake was there, too, smiling as he watched his father interact with the customers, sharing his knowledge, helping them see the value in what they had. It was a new chapter for both of them, and Henry couldn't help but feel grateful for everything that had led him here. Have you ever taken a leap of faith and started something new? Whether it was a project, a career, or a new chapter in your life, what motivated you to take that step? Share your thoughts and experiences with us below. Henry's new workshop was quickly becoming the heart of the small town. Word spread fast about his unique approach to restoring not just cars, but all kinds of forgotten treasures. People brought in everything from broken chairs to old radios, eager to see if Henry could breathe new life into their items. For Henry, it was more than just work. It was a chance to connect with people, to share his skills and experience, and to offer something that the town hadn't had in years, a place where the past was celebrated, not discarded. The more time he spent in the shop, the more alive he felt. Each item he restored was like a new piece of himself being put back together. Jake continued with his studies, but his involvement in the shop became a big part of his life too. He would come by after classes, helping his dad with some of the more complex repairs, or even just to lend a hand organizing the shelves and tools. Their relationship had transformed into something stronger than it had ever been before, and Jake was beginning to understand how much his father's work, and his father's willingness to keep going, meant. One day, as Henry was working on an old motorcycle, a man entered the shop with an item that caught his eye. It was a large wooden frame, cracked and worn, with intricate carvings that had almost faded away with time. The man set it down on one of Henry's workbenches, looking at him expectantly. "You think you can fix this?" the man asked, his voice hopeful. Henry examined the frame carefully. It was old, but the craftsmanship was undeniable. "I can fix this," he said, his voice filled with confidence. "But it's going to take some time." "I'll leave it with you," the man replied. "It's a family heirloom. My father had it, and his father before him. It's all we have left of them." Henry nodded, understanding the sentiment. For him, this wasn't just about restoring a broken object. It was about restoring memories, preserving something that meant more than its surface appearance. It was a connection to the past, something that could help the man hold on to what he had lost. As the days passed, Henry worked meticulously on the frame, carefully sanding away the cracks, restaining the wood, and restoring the carvings with painstaking detail. It was a labor of love, and he poured everything he had into it. When the project was finally done, it was like he had brought the past back to life. The frame now gleamed with a new, polished finish, and the carvings stood out with fresh detail, telling the story of generations long gone. Jake watched his father's process closely, noticing the care Henry took with each item. It wasn't about the job itself. It was about the people behind it, about understanding their stories, and doing everything possible to help them hold on to what mattered. That was the real restoration. When the man returned to pick up the frame, he could hardly believe his eyes. "It's perfect," the man whispered, running his fingers over the newly restored carvings. "You've brought it back to life." Henry smiled, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "It's more than just a frame now. It's a part of your family's history. I'm glad I could help bring that back." The man handed Henry a generous tip, but it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the gratitude in his eyes, the emotion he could barely contain. As he left the shop, Henry felt something deeper than satisfaction. He felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in a long time. He wasn't just fixing things anymore. He was making a difference in people's lives. That night, after closing up shop, Jake and Henry sat together in the small break area at the back of the workshop. The silence was comfortable between them, filled with the hum of the shop's fading lights and the distant sounds of the town settling down for the night. "You know, Dad," Jake said, breaking the silence, "I think you were right. It's not just about fixing things. It's about what they mean to people." Henry nodded, looking around the shop. There was a sense of satisfaction in the air, an energy that came from creating something with purpose. "I've learned that the hard way, Jake. It's never about the object. It's about what it represents. People want to hold on to their memories, their past, and if I can help them do that, then I've done something worthwhile." Jake looked at his dad with admiration. "I've been thinking about that too. I mean, I know I'm still figuring things out, but I think I want to do something that matters too. I want to help people, like you do." Henry smiled at his son, his heart swelling with pride. "You already are, Jake. You're doing it every day. Just by being here, just by showing up, You're helping more than you know." As they sat there together, Henry realized something. It wasn't just the Camaro or the shop that had changed their lives. It was the way they had both learned to show up for each other, to share in the journey, and to take that first step towards something new. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Henry was no longer afraid of where it might lead. As the months passed, Henry's shop continued to grow, attracting more and more people from the town and even neighboring areas. Word had gotten out about his meticulous work and the care he put into every project, whether it was a family heirloom, a vintage car, or something as simple as an old rocking chair that had been passed down through generations. People came not just for repairs but for the stories Henry shared, the wisdom he imparted, and the sense of community he was slowly rebuilding in the small workshop. Jake had settled into his new routine as well. College life was demanding, but he found himself coming back to the shop whenever he could, eager to spend time with his dad. There was something about the workshop, its warmth, its bustle, the smell of fresh wood and grease, that always felt like home to him. He had learned so much about the art of restoration, but more than that, he had learned about patience, about the value of history, and the importance of honoring the past. One sunny afternoon, Henry was in the back of the shop working on a vintage radio when he heard the familiar sound of footsteps entering the front. He looked up to see a familiar face, a woman in her mid-40s, wearing an apron with flour on it, holding a battered old stool. "Hi, Henry," she called out with a friendly wave. It was Lisa, a local baker who had recently opened a small shop down the street. "Lisa, good to see you," Henry said, standing up to greet her. "What can I do for you today?" She set the stool down gently on one of the workbenches and sighed. "This old thing's been in my family for generations. My grandmother used to sit on it while she baked. It's seen better days, but I don't want to just throw it away. I was hoping you could give it a little love and attention." Henry examined the stool, which was worn and cracked. Its once beautiful wood now faded and chipped. It was a simple piece, but like everything else he restored, it had a story to tell. "I'll take care of it for you," he said, running a hand over the worn surface. "Don't worry, it'll be good as new." Lisa smiled with relief. "Thank you, Henry. You've got a gift for this stuff." As Henry worked on the stool over the next few days, he began to notice something that had begun to happen with increasing regularity. More and more people from the community, neighbors, friends, and even strangers, were bringing in their cherished items for restoration. Some of them came with just a simple request, "Can you fix this?" Others, like Lisa, came with a story, a history they were desperate to preserve. One afternoon, a young couple came into the shop with a cracked wooden chest. They explained it had been passed down to them by the bride's grandmother, and though it was now broken, it held sentimental value that was irreplaceable. "We were thinking of getting rid of it," the husband said, clearly torn, "but something told us we should bring it here instead. It's not just a chest. It's a piece of our family's history." Henry knew exactly what to do. He took the chest into his workshop, carefully restored the wood, repaired the cracks, and polished it back to its former glory. When the couple returned, they were speechless at how it had turned out. The chest wasn't just restored, it had been reborn. As he handed it back to them, Henry noticed how the couple held it with a reverence, as if it wasn't just a piece of furniture but a symbol of their family's legacy. They thanked him profusely, leaving the shop with the chest as if they were walking away with a part of their history intact. Over the next few weeks, the shop began to feel like a gathering place, a space where the community came together not just to restore physical items, but to share memories, to celebrate the past, and to honor the things that truly mattered. It wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about healing the emotional connections that these objects represented. Jake noticed the change, too. He could feel the shift in his dad. Henry had always been the quiet, reserved type, but now he seemed more at peace, more confident. He wasn't just fixing things. He was building relationships. He was becoming the heart of the community in a way that no one had expected. One evening, after closing up the shop, Jake and Henry were sitting at the small table in the back, sipping coffee and discussing the day. "You know, Dad," Jake said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking. This shop, it's more than just your business. It's like a bridge for people. They bring in their memories, their past, and you help them hold on to it. That's more important than anything else." Henry nodded slowly, staring at the workbench in front of him, where the pieces of the stool were now dry and ready for reassembly. I never thought of it that way, but you're right. I guess I've been restoring more than just things. I've been helping people find a way to keep a part of themselves intact. Jake smiled, his pride in his father swelling. You've done something really special, Dad. And I think it's just the beginning. As they sat together, the hum of the shop seemed to fade into the background, and Henry realized how much had changed. When he first opened the doors to the workshop, he had no idea how it would shape his life, or how it would become a place where people didn't just fix things, they healed. Now, looking at Jake, looking at the people who came in and out of his shop, Henry understood that the restoration process wasn't just about mending broken things. It was about bringing people together, giving them something to hold on to, and showing them that even in the face of loss, there was always something worth saving. What's one object in your life that holds deep sentimental value to you? What makes it so special, and what memories are tied to it? We'd love to hear your story. As the seasons changed, the workshop grew busier than ever. With every new project that walked through the door, Henry was reminded of just how much this small shop had become a part of the town's heartbeat. He had seen cars transformed, old furniture made new, and even photographs restored to their former glory. But it wasn't just the objects that changed, it was the people. One chilly autumn morning, as Henry was adjusting the gears of an old bicycle, a young woman entered the shop. She looked a bit out of place, dressed in office attire, her face framed by dark sunglasses that hid the strain in her eyes. She was clutching an old leather suitcase, the kind you might find in a thrift store, its corners worn and faded. "Excuse me," she said, her voice a little unsure. "I was wondering if you could help me with something. It's an heirloom of sorts." Henry looked up from his workbench, intrigued by her tone. "Of course. What do you need help with?" The woman hesitated for a moment before setting the suitcase down gently on the counter. She reached into her bag, pulling out an old, yellowed letter. "This was my grandmother's. She used to travel the world with it. My mother gave it to me when she passed. I don't know what to do with it. It's been sitting in my attic for years, but I think it's time to open it to see what's inside." Henry could sense the weight of her words. There was something more to this suitcase than just its age. "You want me to restore it?" he asked gently, setting his tools down. The woman nodded, her fingers trembling as she ran them over the suitcase's worn leather. "I don't know why I'm so attached to it, but I am, and I think it's time for me to face what's inside." Henry studied the suitcase carefully. It was a bit more than he usually dealt with. Though it wasn't in terrible condition, the leather had seen better days. The latches were stiff, and the seams were beginning to unravel. But what intrigued him most was the sense of hesitation in the woman's voice. There was a history in this suitcase, a story that had yet to be told. "I'll take a look," Henry said. "I can restore the leather, re-sew the seams, but it's the contents you'll need to face. Are you sure you're ready for that?" She swallowed hard, nodding again. "I think I am. I don't want to do it alone." Henry smiled gently. "I'll help you as best as I can." Over the next few days, Henry worked on the suitcase. He carefully cleaned and restored the leather, reinforcing the seams and polishing the latches until they clicked open with ease. He could tell that it was a labor of love for the woman, and he hoped that when she opened it, she would find what she was looking for. Finally, the day came for the suitcase to be ready. Henry was cleaning up his tools when the woman returned. She walked in slowly, this time without the sunglasses, her eyes clear and steady. "It's done," Henry said, nodding toward the counter where the restored suitcase Saturday. "It's as good as new. But I think the real work is up to you." The woman smiled faintly, her eyes flickering with a mix of apprehension and relief. "Thank you," she said quietly. She took a deep breath and slowly unlatched the suitcase, her fingers brushing over the brass closures as if they were the final barrier between her and whatever was inside. She opened the suitcase slowly, revealing a collection of neatly folded papers, old postcards from places her grandmother had visited, and a faded journal with the pages yellowed by time. But there was one thing that caught her eye, a small, velvet pouch nestled among the items. She picked it up carefully, her hands shaking as she untied the drawstring. Inside the pouch, There was a delicate silver necklace, its pendant shaped like a small globe. It was beautiful, and yet it seemed almost out of place among the other items, its shine untouched by time. "I remember this," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "It was my grandmother's favorite piece of jewelry. She always said it was a reminder to never stop exploring the world." Henry watched quietly as the woman carefully placed the necklace around her neck. It was as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She straightened up, her face a little brighter than before. "Thank you, Henry," she said, her eyes glistening. "I didn't realize how much I needed this, both the restoration of the suitcase and the restoration of what it held. I thought I'd left everything behind when I moved away from home, but now I see it was never really gone. It was just waiting for me to come back." Henry smiled, feeling a quiet satisfaction. Sometimes, the things we hold on to are just waiting for the right time to come forward. And sometimes, it takes a little help to get there. The woman smiled warmly, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I'm not sure I would have opened it without you. You didn't just fix the suitcase, Henry. You helped me face something I was too afraid to face." As she left the shop, the soft jingle of the doorbell seemed to echo in the quiet of the room. Henry couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. He had spent years restoring broken things, but it wasn't the objects themselves that held the true value. It was the way they brought people face to face with their own memories, their own stories. It had been the same with the man who had brought in the broken chest, and with Lisa's family heirloom. And now, with this young woman and her grandmother's suitcase, Henry had become more than just a craftsman. He had become a guide for others to reconnect with their pasts, to rediscover the parts of themselves they had forgotten or left behind. That evening, as Henry sat back in his chair, Jake came into the shop, ready to help close up for the night. "Dad, I was thinking," Jake started, leaning against the counter. "You've done a lot more than just fix stuff. You've helped people find something they lost, even if they didn't know they were looking for it." Henry looked at his son, his heart full. "I guess I never thought of it that way, but you're right. It's not just about the objects. It's about giving people a chance to reconnect with the parts of themselves that matter most." Jake smiled, his admiration for his father growing. "And you're good at it. Really good." Henry smiled back, feeling content. "Well, I've had a lot of practice. And I've got a good teacher." Jake laughed, and the two of them shared a moment of quiet camaraderie. The shop wasn't just a place of work anymore. It had become a place of connection, a place where people came not just to restore the broken, but to find pieces of themselves they'd lost along the way. Have you ever come across an old item that you thought was just junk, only to discover that it held a deeper meaning? Share your story with us and tell us what it taught you. As winter settled in, the workshop took on a peaceful stillness. The holidays were fast approaching, and with the first snowfall came a sense of quiet reflection. Henry had seen so many people come and go from his shop, each leaving behind a little piece of themselves, but there was one thing missing from his life: his own family. For all the joy the shop brought him, the restoration of broken objects and mended memories, there remained a part of Henry's heart that longed for something more, a family reunion of sorts. He had worked hard to build this new life, but the ache of past mistakes and missed opportunities lingered. He hadn't been the perfect father, and though he and Jake had come a long way, there was a space in his heart that no amount of work could fill. It was during one of these quiet moments, as he sat by the stove with a cup of coffee, that the phone rang. The ringtone was familiar, a soft, almost nostalgic sound that made Henry pause. He didn't often get calls like this anymore. He picked up the receiver. "Hello? Dad?" It was Jake's voice, and there was a noticeable excitement in it. "I'm coming over tomorrow. I've got a surprise for you." Henry's heart skipped a beat. "A surprise? What's going on?" Jake chuckled. "You'll see. I'll be there in the afternoon. Don't make any plans." Henry's mind raced. He couldn't remember the last time Jake had said something like that. His son was always thoughtful, but this felt different, like there was something important coming, something that would change things. The next day, Jake arrived promptly after lunch, his arms full of bags. Henry greeted him at the door, his curiosity growing. "What's all this?" Henry asked, stepping aside to let Jake in. "You'll see in a minute," Jake said, a wide grin on his face. He set the bags down on the counter and turned toward the door. But first, there's someone else here I want you to meet. Henry's heart pounded. Who? Jake opened the door behind him, and Henry's breath caught in his throat. Standing there, looking a little nervous but determined, was a woman. One he hadn't seen in years. She was older now, with her hair streaked with gray and her face lined with time. But Henry knew instantly who she was. Laura, Henry whispered, almost as if he couldn't believe it. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotions that had been buried for so long. Laura, his ex-wife, stood there with a soft smile, holding a small, wrapped gift in her hands. She took a step forward and placed it in Henry's hands. I wasn't sure how to do this, she said, her voice gentle but filled with warmth. But I thought it was time. For both of us. For Jake. For the family. Henry stood frozen for a moment, unable to speak. The years between them seemed to dissolve in the quiet space of the workshop. There was so much left unsaid between them. So many unresolved feelings. But in this moment, the past didn't matter as much as the present. The fact that Laura was standing there, wanting to be a part of the family again, meant more than anything. Jake watched them carefully, standing just behind Laura. He had always been the bridge between them, even as a child, and now, as an adult, he was trying to make things right. I thought, Jake said, his voice hesitant but hopeful, maybe it's time for us all to start over, to fix things. Not just the old furniture in the shop, but us. Laura nodded, her eyes meeting Henry's. We've both made our mistakes, but we've both learned. And maybe, just maybe, there's still something worth saving. Henry swallowed hard, emotions swirling inside him. He had never expected this. Never expected that his family would come back together in such a quiet, unexpected way. But now that they were here, standing in the workshop, he knew it was the beginning of something new. He took a deep breath, setting the gift down on the counter. Then he looked at Jake, and then at Laura. I don't know if I have the right words to say, but I'm glad you're here. Both of you. Laura smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. It's never too late to start again, Henry. Never too late. The three of them sat down together, the warmth of the fire crackling in the background. They talked for hours, about the past, about the mistakes they had made, about the things they had lost and the things they hoped to find again. There was laughter, and there were tears, but more than anything, there was a sense of healing. As the evening wore on, Jake excused himself, leaving his parents to talk in private. Henry and Laura sat in silence for a while, each processing the years that had passed. I've missed you, Henry said finally, his voice soft. I've missed you too, Laura replied, reaching for his hand. We didn't always get it right, Henry, but we can get it right now. Together. Henry smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The shop, his little corner of the world, had brought them back together. In a way, it wasn't just the objects he had fixed. It was his own broken heart, now mending with the people who mattered most. As they sat there, side by side, the warmth of the fire filling the room, Henry realized that sometimes the greatest restoration didn't happen in the shop. It happened in the people around him. The next chapter in their lives was about to begin, and Henry was ready for it. Ready for the family he had always wanted, for the love that had been waiting to bloom once again. Have you ever been given a second chance to fix a broken relationship? How did you take that opportunity, and what did it mean to you? Share your thoughts with us. The days that followed the reunion felt like a dream to Henry. For the first time in years, his life had taken an unexpected turn toward healing. The restoration of his family wasn't as quick or as smooth as fixing a broken chair or an old chest, but it was the kind of work that required patience, understanding, and a lot of love. As the holidays drew closer, Henry found himself feeling more connected to those around him. The shop, though busy, seemed to serve as a backdrop to something much more meaningful, the mending of broken bonds. There was a sense of anticipation in the air. The whole town was gearing up for the Christmas festivities, and Henry, along with Jake and Laura, had made plans to spend the season together. It was a chance to rebuild memories, to create new traditions, and to enjoy the quiet moments that had always been so precious. But just as things seemed to be falling into place, Life had a way of reminding Henry that true change was often accompanied by new challenges. One crisp evening, as Henry was locking up the shop after a long day, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. It was Evelyn, the woman who had brought in the old suitcase months ago. Her face was etched with concern, and she stepped inside without waiting for a greeting. "Henry, I need your help again," she said, her voice tinged with worry. It's about the necklace. The one I found in my grandmother's suitcase." Henry nodded, inviting her to sit. "Of course, Evelyn. What's going on?" She took a deep breath, sitting down at the counter. "I've been wearing the necklace every day since I found it. It's like it's become a part of me. But something strange has been happening. I feel like it's calling to me, like there's more to the story. I don't know how to explain it, but I can't shake this feeling that I'm missing something important." Henry studied her, sensing the weight in her words. "What do you mean? What's been happening?" Evelyn shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I've had dreams. Strange ones. Dreams about my grandmother, about places she visited that I don't remember her telling me about. It's like I'm seeing through her eyes. And then there's the necklace. It's like it's leading me somewhere, but I don't know where." Henry felt a ripple of unease. "What are you asking me to do, Evelyn?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice soft. "I thought maybe you could help me understand. Could you look at the necklace again? Maybe there's something I missed. Something I'm supposed to find." Henry's mind raced as he took the delicate necklace from her hands. The silver pendant, shaped like a globe, glimmered in the dim light of the shop. He had seen it many times before, but he hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. Yet, Evelyn's sense of urgency was undeniable. "Let me take a closer look," he said, examining the pendant carefully. There was something almost magnetic about it, something he couldn't quite place. "I'll clean it up and see if there's anything hidden, anything you might have missed." Evelyn nodded, looking both relieved and anxious. "Thank you, Henry. I don't know why, but I feel like this necklace holds the key to something I need to understand." Henry carefully cleaned the pendant with a soft cloth, running his fingers along its edges. He noticed a small engraving, one that had been almost impossible to see before. It was faint, almost hidden beneath the intricate design, but it was there. An address, a location that was unfamiliar to him. "This is strange," he murmured, showing it to Evelyn. "There's something engraved here. It looks like an address." Evelyn leaned in closer, her eyes widening. That's a place I've never heard of, but I think my grandmother used to mention it. It was something to do with a trip she took before I was born. She never talked about it much, though." Henry felt a chill run down his spine. This was no ordinary necklace. It was a key, a clue to something hidden in the past. "I think we need to investigate," he said, his voice steady. "This may be more than just a family heirloom. It could be a part of your grandmother's history that's been lost for decades." Evelyn nodded eagerly, her fear now mixed with curiosity. "But I can't do this alone. I need you to come with me." Henry thought for a moment. He had learned long ago that sometimes the greatest gifts came in unexpected packages, and sometimes those gifts required courage to open. This was one of those times. "I'll go with you," he said, his decision made. "We'll figure this out together." The next day, Henry and Evelyn set off to the location engraved on the necklace. It was a small town on the outskirts, a place that Henry had passed by 100 times but had never thought to explore. The journey was quiet, filled with the soft hum of the car's engine and the occasional exchange of small talk. Evelyn seemed both nervous and excited, her eyes glued to the road as if the destination was the answer to a question she had been asking for years. When they arrived, the town seemed frozen in time. The buildings were old, their paint chipped, but there was a strange charm to the place. It looked like something out of a different era, as though the world had passed it by without ever really noticing. Evelyn led Henry to a small, weathered house at the end of a quiet street. The address from the necklace matched perfectly. She hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath before walking up to the front door. Henry followed, sensing that whatever was inside this house would change Evelyn's life forever. She knocked softly, and after a long pause, the door creaked open. An elderly woman stood there, her face wrinkled with age but her eyes sharp and filled with recognition. "Hello, dear," the woman said, her voice both gentle and knowing. "I knew you would come." Evelyn's heart raced. You knew?" The woman nodded, a small smile on her face. "Your grandmother left something for you. A gift she wanted you to find when the time was right. And now, it's your turn to carry on her legacy. Have you ever followed a clue from the past that led to something unexpected? Share your story with us. What did it teach you about the importance of history and discovery?" The old woman stepped aside, allowing Henry and Evelyn to enter the house. It was small, almost quaint, with dark wooden floors and shelves lined with antiques. The air smelled faintly of herbs and old paper. The walls were decorated with photographs, some faded with time, others still vibrant, each one telling a story. But what caught Henry's attention was the old wooden trunk sitting in the corner of the living room. Evelyn's eyes were drawn immediately to it. That's the trunk," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My grandmother always talked about it, but she never let me see what was inside." The woman, who introduced herself as Marla, nodded slowly. "Your grandmother wanted you to have it, Evelyn. She knew you'd find it one day." Evelyn stood frozen, unsure whether to approach the trunk or take a step back. The weight of the moment hung in the air, thick with history and anticipation. Henry placed a hand on her shoulder, offering silent support. After a long pause, Evelyn nodded and slowly walked toward the trunk, her heart racing. As she bent down to lift the heavy lid, a mix of excitement and fear swirled within her. The trunk creaked as it opened, revealing a pile of old letters, yellowed with age, and a small, dusty leather-bound book. A single photograph lay atop the stack of papers. It was a picture of a young woman, Evelyn's grandmother, smiling brightly in front of a large building that Evelyn didn't recognize. "This is," Evelyn began, her voice barely a whisper. "This is my grandmother. But where is this? What is this place?" Marla stepped forward, her eyes softening as she looked at the photograph. "That was taken in a place called Ravenswood Manor, just outside of town. It's where your grandmother grew up. She left it behind when she married your grandfather, but part of her always carried that place with her." Evelyn's hands shook as she held the photograph. "Ravenswood Manor? I've never heard of it." "Most people haven't," Marla said with a wry smile. "It's been abandoned for years. But your grandmother was the daughter of the estate's owner, and there are secrets buried there. Secrets she never wanted to confront. She kept them hidden, even from her own family." Henry could feel the weight of the room shift. There was something profound in the way Marla spoke, a sense that the answers Evelyn had been searching for lay just beyond their grasp. Evelyn carefully picked up the leather-bound book, her fingers tracing its worn edges. The cover was plain, but the weight of it seemed significant. "This is hers, isn't it?" Evelyn asked, her voice steadying. "Yes," Marla confirmed. "It's her journal. She wrote in it all the time, even when she didn't want anyone to know what was inside. She was afraid of what would happen if the truth ever came out." Evelyn opened the book, flipping through its pages. The writing was neat and precise, filled with details about life at Ravenswood Manor. Details that painted a picture of a life of privilege, but also one filled with shadows. As she read, Evelyn began to understand her grandmother's fear. There were mentions of a forbidden love, of secrets kept hidden from the world, and of a tragedy that had struck the family many years ago. "The journal, it's all here," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "The story my grandmother never told me." Henry stood quietly behind her, feeling as if he was intruding on a deeply personal moment. He wanted to give Evelyn space to process everything, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just family history. There was something about Ravenswood Manor, something dark and mysterious, that lingered in the air. Marla spoke again, breaking the silence. "Evelyn, I know you have questions, but there are things in that journal that may be too painful to uncover. Your grandmother tried to forget them, but if you're ready to learn the truth, it's all there. The answers you've been seeking." Evelyn closed the book gently, her eyes still fixed on the pages she had just read. Her emotions were a whirlwind, shock, grief, and confusion all mixed together. "I don't know if I'm ready for all of this. I never thought my family's past would be like this, so full of secrets." Henry could see the weight of the decision on her face. You don't have to go through this alone, Evelyn. We'll figure it out together. We can visit Ravenswood Manor and see if we can uncover the truth. Whatever it takes. Evelyn looked up at him, her expression softening. Thank you, Henry. I don't know what I'd do without you. The decision was made. They would visit Ravenswood Manor. Henry had seen enough of the world to know that some mysteries couldn't be ignored, especially when they were tied to family. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready to help Evelyn face it, whether it was painful or liberating. The next morning, Henry, Evelyn, and Marla set out for Ravenswood Manor. The journey was long, winding through dense woods and narrow roads. The manor itself stood atop a hill, looming like a forgotten relic from another time. It was as grand as it was decayed, its stone walls cracked and weathered, its windows dark and empty. As they stood before the manor, the weight of its history pressed down on them. Evelyn's eyes were filled with a mixture of awe and fear. This was the place her grandmother had once called home, the place that held the key to so many unanswered questions. I've heard stories about this place, Marla said, her voice barely above a whisper. Some say it's haunted by the past, but I don't think it's the ghosts that should worry us. Evelyn nodded, taking a deep breath. We're going inside, aren't we? We are, Henry said, offering her a reassuring smile. We'll face whatever is inside together. As they walked toward the entrance, the heavy door creaked open as if it had been waiting for them. Inside, the air was musty, the floors covered in dust. But there was something else, something alive in the air, as though the manor itself was holding its breath. Evelyn's steps faltered for a moment, but then she pressed forward. The journey had begun. The truth would be revealed, no matter how painful. The secrets of Ravenswood Manor would finally come to light. Have you ever uncovered a family secret that changed your understanding of the past? How did it make you feel? Share your thoughts with us. The grand entrance of Ravenswood Manor loomed before them, its tall double doors creaking as they pushed against the weight of time. Evelyn stepped forward, her hand lingering on the tarnished brass doorknob. The house seemed to exhale a breath, as if welcoming them in after years of silence. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the kind that settled over years of abandonment. The once elegant furnishings were now faded, their luster lost to the ravages of time. Henry glanced around, taking in the faded grandeur of the place. There was an undeniable beauty in the decay, a sense of mystery that clung to every corner. It was clear that Ravenswood Manor had once been a magnificent estate, filled with life, laughter, and secrets. Where do we start? Evelyn asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something hidden in the shadows. Marla, who had been here before, but never ventured far beyond the front hall, looked hesitant. The study, she suggested, her voice filled with a quiet reverence. That's where your grandmother kept the most important things, the things she never wanted anyone to find. Henry nodded, taking the lead as they walked deeper into the manor. The long hallway stretched before them, its walls lined with portraits of people Evelyn didn't recognize, men and women dressed in fine clothes, their faces stern and dignified. Each one seemed to gaze down at them with silent judgment, as if they were waiting for something to happen. Finally, they reached a large wooden door at the end of the hallway. Marla hesitated, her hand resting on the knob. "Are you sure you want to go in there?" she asked Evelyn, her eyes filled with concern. Evelyn looked at her, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. "I need to know," she said, her voice firm, though tinged with fear. "I need to understand everything." With a nod, Marla opened the door, revealing the study. It was a room frozen in time, filled with towering bookshelves, a massive desk covered in yellowed papers, and a large fireplace that hadn't been lit in years. The room smelled of old books and dust, the air still and thick with the weight of forgotten history. As they stepped inside, Evelyn's eyes were drawn to a set of drawers at the far end of the room. She felt a pull, as though something in that corner was calling to her. She walked over, Henry and Marla following closely behind. The drawers were old and weathered, their handles tarnished with age. Evelyn carefully opened the top drawer, her fingers trembling as she pulled it open. Inside, she found more journals, her grandmother's journals, stacked neatly beside a series of letters, each one tied with a faded ribbon. She could hardly breathe as she picked up the first letter, its edges yellowed and brittle with age. "Look at this," Evelyn murmured, holding the letter out to Henry. He took it from her hands, his heart racing as he saw the name written in delicate script on the envelope. It was addressed to Evelyn's grandmother, but the name on the return address was one Henry didn't recognize. "Who's this?" Henry asked, his voice low, but filled with curiosity. Evelyn squinted at the name. "Lyle Cormack," she said slowly. "I don't know who that is." Marla's face paled as she stepped forward. "Lyle Cormack," she trailed off, her voice shaking. "That name. It's connected to your grandmother's past. But it's not something anyone talks about." Evelyn's heart raced. "What do you mean? Who is he?" Marla glanced nervously around the room, her eyes flicking to the door as if someone might be listening. "Lyle was your grandmother's first love. They were supposed to be together, but something happened. Something tragic. Your grandmother never spoke of him after that. She erased him from her life, even from her memories. But he was the one person she never truly forgot." Evelyn felt a tight knot form in her stomach. "But why? What happened?" Marla hesitated, taking a deep breath before answering. "It was a forbidden love. Your grandmother's family didn't approve of Lyle. He was different. And then, one night, something terrible happened. There was a fire at Ravenswood Manor. Your grandmother never told anyone what really happened that night, but it's believed that Lyle was involved." Evelyn shook her head, disbelief washing over her. "No, that can't be right. My grandmother would never keep something like that from me. She loved me so much." "I know," Marla said softly, "but sometimes the people we love keep secrets to protect us. I think your grandmother wanted to spare you from the pain of the past." Henry reached out, placing a comforting hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "This is a lot to process. Maybe we should go through these letters and journals before making any assumptions." Evelyn nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek as she sat down at the desk. She opened the first letter, the ink faded but still legible. As she read, the words seemed to unravel a long-forgotten story, a story of love, loss, and betrayal that had haunted her grandmother for decades. Each letter she read revealed a piece of the puzzle: Lyle's love for her grandmother, the forbidden nature of their relationship, and the tragedy that followed. There were mentions of a fire, of lost memories, and of a decision that had torn families apart. The more Evelyn read, the clearer it became that her grandmother had lived through something far more complicated than she had ever imagined. "This is unbelievable," Evelyn whispered, her voice shaking. "Why didn't she tell me any of this?" Marla sighed, her face filled with sorrow. "Some wounds run deep, Evelyn. Your grandmother carried this burden her entire life. But maybe it's time to finally understand the truth." As Evelyn read through the letters and journals, she pieced together the story of a love that had been forbidden, of a family torn apart by secrets, and of a woman who had been forced to choose between love and duty. But one question still lingered in her mind. If Lyle was involved in the fire, then why isn't there any record of him? Why wasn't he punished? She asked aloud, more to herself than anyone else. Marla's face darkened, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Because, Evelyn, the truth was hidden. The fire wasn't an accident. It was deliberately set, and the real culprit was never found." Evelyn's mind raced as she absorbed the gravity of Marla's words. So someone covered it up? But why? Marla shook her head, looking troubled. "There's much more to this story, but some of it is too dangerous to uncover. Be careful, Evelyn. Not everything in this house should be disturbed." Henry turned to look at Evelyn. "We've come this far. Whatever the truth is, we'll face it together. But we need to decide if we're ready for whatever comes next." Evelyn looked at the letters in her hands, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear. The truth about her grandmother's past was no longer a mystery. It was a legacy of love and tragedy that would shape her future. "We have to finish this," Evelyn said, determination flooding her voice. "I can't walk away from this now. Have you ever unearthed a family secret that changed everything for you? How did it affect your relationship with your past? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. The study felt colder now, the weight of the secrets within the old walls pressing down on them. Evelyn sat at the desk, the letters and journals spread out before her, each page revealing more of her grandmother's tragic past. But there was still one question lingering in her mind. What truly happened the night of the fire? Why had Lyle Cormack disappeared without a trace? Henry watched Evelyn, his concern evident on his face. She had been reading for hours, her eyes scanning the pages as if they held the answers to a question she'd been carrying her whole life. But the more she read, the more confused she seemed to become. Each revelation only led to more questions. Marla stood near the fireplace, her arms crossed as she looked out the window, lost in thought. "The manor holds many memories," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. "Some memories should be left in the past." Evelyn looked up, her eyes filled with determination. "I can't leave this unfinished. My grandmother was too afraid to confront this, but I have to know the truth. I owe it to her, and to myself." Henry nodded in agreement. "We've come this far. We can't turn back now." Marla sighed, her eyes clouded with old memories. "You're right. But be warned, what you're about to discover might not bring the closure you're hoping for." Evelyn's heart raced. She picked up a particularly worn letter, its edges frayed with age. It was addressed to her grandmother, but this time, the writing was different. It wasn't Lyle's handwriting. It was a formal letter, written on official stationery. The letterhead was unfamiliar, and the words on the page were sharp, cold, and filled with threat. Evelyn read aloud, her voice trembling as she spoke the words. "It has come to our attention that your family has been involved in a series of unsanctioned activities. If you wish to avoid further complications, it is imperative that you sever all ties with Lyle Cormack. Should you fail to comply, consequences will be severe." Henry stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Who wrote this? And what unsanctioned activities are they referring to?" Marla's face turned pale, and she looked away. "The letter was from your grandmother's family. They were not the kind of people who tolerated rebellion. Lyle was a man of ideals, of passion. But your grandmother's family had their own agenda. They were wealthy, powerful, and they saw Lyle as a threat." Evelyn's mind was reeling. "A threat? How? What did he do?" "Lyle had a vision," Marla said, her voice lowering. "He wanted to take the manor away from the family, to turn it into something different. A place where people could live freely, away from the constraints of the world outside. But your grandmother's family didn't share his ideals. They saw him as a dangerous revolutionary. And the fire, it wasn't just an accident." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean it wasn't an accident?" "The fire was set deliberately," Marla said softly, her voice filled with sorrow, "and Lyle was blamed for it. They used him as a scapegoat. But it wasn't him. Your grandmother knew the truth, but she couldn't prove it. And because of that, she lost everything. Her family, her love, and even her peace of mind." Evelyn stared at the letter in her hands, the weight of the truth sinking in. "But why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she tell anyone?" "Because she was scared," Marla said quietly. "Your grandmother was always afraid that the truth would destroy her. She had to leave it behind to survive. But the guilt, it never left her." Henry placed a hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "This is a lot to take in, Evelyn, but we need to know everything. If we're going to understand what happened, we have to keep digging." Evelyn nodded, her mind made up. "We need to find out who really started the fire. And we need to know where Lyle is now." Marla looked at her, her expression grim. "You don't understand. There's more to this than just the fire. There are people who would do anything to keep this secret buried. Lyle was only the beginning. The family had a lot more to lose than anyone realized." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her resolve strengthening. "Then I'll expose them. I won't let my grandmother's memory be tarnished by lies." Together, they left the study and made their way through the dark halls of Ravenswood Manor. As they moved deeper into the house, Evelyn felt the house's history pressing down on her. It was as if the walls themselves held the weight of the secrets that had been hidden here for so long. They arrived at a small room at the back of the house, a place that seemed untouched by time. The air inside was cooler, and the faint smell of tobacco still lingered. There was a desk in the corner, its surface cluttered with papers, but one object on the desk caught Evelyn's attention. It was a small, tarnished key. "What is this?" she asked, picking it up. "That's the key to the old cellar," Marla said, her voice tight. "The cellar where the family hid their most precious possessions. They kept records there, records of everything, including the fire." Evelyn's pulse quickened. "We need to get in there." Marla hesitated. "I'm not sure you're ready for what you'll find." Evelyn looked at her, her eyes determined. "I have to know the truth. I can't leave here without it." With a reluctant nod, Marla led them down the narrow hallway to a hidden door. She inserted the key, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the dark. Evelyn's heart pounded as they descended into the depths of the manor. The cellar was cold, the stone walls damp and covered with moss. There were old crates and barrels scattered around, but it was the far corner of the room that caught Evelyn's eye. There, half hidden beneath a pile of dust and debris, was a large chest. The chest was sealed with an iron lock, but as she approached, Evelyn could feel the weight of something important within. "This is it," she whispered, her voice filled with anticipation. "This is where it all started." Henry stepped forward, his hand on her arm. "Let's open it together." With a deep breath, Evelyn knelt beside the chest and pried it open. Inside, she found more than she could have ever imagined. Photographs, letters, and a leather-bound journal. But at the very bottom, buried beneath it all, was something even more significant. A set of old documents, yellowed with age and bearing the family crest. Evelyn's fingers shook as she pulled the papers free. She scanned them quickly, her heart racing as she saw the words written on the top page. "The truth about the Ravenswood fire. Have you ever uncovered something hidden in your family's past? How did it change your perception of your history? Share your thoughts with us in the comments." Evelyn held the papers in her hands, the weight of their significance almost unbearable. Her heart raced as she looked at the faded text that now seemed to answer all the questions that had plagued her for so long. The truth about the Ravenswood fire, the tragedy that had torn her family apart, was finally within her reach. Henry stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, sensing the gravity of the moment. Marla, too, watched with a look of quiet anticipation, knowing that whatever Evelyn discovered in those pages would change everything. Evelyn took a deep breath and began reading aloud, her voice shaking slightly with the effort of understanding the words that were now coming into focus. "This is to be kept in strictest confidence. The fire that destroyed Ravenswood Manor was no accident. It was deliberately set by a member of this household, under duress, and it was not caused by a mere accident, but by an intentional act of sabotage. The person responsible for this was none other than Lyle Cormack." Evelyn stopped reading, her breath caught in her throat. The words felt like a slap in the face. She looked up at Marla, who had gone pale. "No, this can't be true," Evelyn whispered. "Lyle couldn't have done this. He wasn't the one who set the fire. He was trying to protect my grandmother." Marla's eyes were filled with a sorrowful understanding. "I know it's hard to believe, but there's more. Keep reading." With trembling hands, Evelyn continued reading. Lyle Cormack was coerced into starting the fire by an unknown figure within the family. His actions, though grievous, were the result of manipulation and threats. The true mastermind behind the fire has never been identified, but it is believed to have been someone close to your grandmother's father. The words blurred before Evelyn's eyes as her mind raced. She looked up at Henry. "So, Lyle didn't start the fire on his own. He was forced into it?" Henry nodded slowly. "It seems that way. Whoever did this manipulated Lyle, used him as a pawn in some bigger scheme." Evelyn's mind whirled with confusion and fury. Who would do such a thing? And why? Marla spoke, her voice heavy with the weight of her own knowledge. Lyle was never meant to be the one blamed. But after the fire, the family decided to pin the blame on him. They didn't want to lose everything, so they buried the truth. Your grandmother knew the truth, but she couldn't expose it without risking everything. Her family, her future, her reputation. Evelyn clenched the papers tightly in her hands. "My grandmother, she never told me. She never told anyone. She wanted to protect you, Marla said softly. But sometimes, protecting the people we love means carrying burdens no one should have to bear. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her chest. Her grandmother had lived with this secret for so many years, and yet she had never once shared the pain with her. Evelyn felt a pang of loss for the woman who had been both a protector and a prisoner to her own past. As she read the final lines of the document, her breath caught again. It is said that Lyle Cormac disappeared after the fire, leaving no trace of his whereabouts. There were rumors that he fled, but the truth is that Lyle Cormac never left Ravenswood. He was hidden away by someone in the family, someone who wanted to ensure that the fire's true origins remained a mystery. The one person who knew the full story was your grandmother, and she carried that knowledge to her grave. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. Lyle never left. He's here, somewhere in Ravenswood. The room seemed to grow colder as the truth set in. The fire had been a tragedy, but it was also a cover-up designed to protect the Ravenswood family's secrets. And at the heart of it all was Lyle, the man Evelyn's grandmother had loved and lost. "Where is he?" Evelyn whispered. "Where did they hide him?" Marla shook her head. "I don't know, but there are people who still live here who remember. People who were part of the family's inner circle back then. They might have answers." Evelyn stood up, her legs unsteady but her resolve firm. "I have to find him. I have to find Lyle. I have to understand the whole story. Everything my grandmother went through." Henry placed a hand on her arm. "You don't have to do this alone, Evelyn. We'll help you. We'll uncover the truth together." Marla, too, nodded. "But be careful. There are forces in this house, people who don't want the past to be uncovered. Some truths are dangerous to reveal." Evelyn took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I know, but I can't stop now. I have to find him. I have to know the whole story. For my grandmother." The trio made their way through the dark halls of Ravenswood Manor, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Every corner of the house seemed to hold a secret, every shadow a memory of something long buried. But now, Evelyn knew that the time had come to bring those secrets to light. They reached the back of the house, to the old servants' quarters. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the corners. Marla led them to a narrow door at the end of the hall, a door Evelyn had never noticed before. It was small, unassuming, and nearly hidden from view. "This is where they kept the old records," Marla said, her voice hushed. "Where they hid the past." Evelyn's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. With a deep breath, she opened it. Inside, the room was filled with rows of shelves, each one crammed with old boxes and files. At the back of the room, behind a stack of dusty crates, was a small chest. The chest was locked, but Evelyn had the key now. She inserted it and turned it slowly. The lid creaked open, revealing a set of old, worn journals. But among them, buried at the bottom of the chest, was a photograph. A photograph of a young Lyle Cormac, standing in front of Ravenswood Manor, a wistful smile on his face. He looked so much like her grandmother, so much like the man she had loved. Beside the photo was a final letter, written in the same delicate handwriting as before. It was addressed to Evelyn's grandmother, but this one held a final, desperate plea. "I never wanted to hurt you, but I had no choice. They made me do it. I had to protect you. I had to protect Ravenswood." Evelyn's heart pounded as she held the letter in her hands. The final pieces of the puzzle were coming together. Lyle had never been the villain. He had been a victim, just like her grandmother. Tears welled up in her eyes as she read the last line of the letter. "I love you always." What would you do if you uncovered a truth that completely changed your perception of your family? Would you seek justice or protect the legacy of the past? Share your thoughts with us in the comments.